Hey guys, welcome back. If you're new here, hi, pull up a blanket, find your most comfortable position, and get ready to learn absolutely nothing useful for tomorrow morning. That's kind of the whole point. Tonight we're going somewhere very, very old. We're talking about a place so ancient that basically every civilization that came after it owes it a thank you note, and probably an apology for forgetting about it for a few centuries. We're going to Mesopotamia. Now, before your eyes glaze over, and honestly, they should, that's the goal. I want you to understand something. Mesopotamia isn't just some dusty textbook chapter sandwiched between early hominids and ancient Egypt. It was a living, breathing, deeply weird, deeply human place. People there worried about money. They complained about bad service. They had terrible neighbors and complicated family drama and government bureaucracy that made them want to scream into the void. Sound familiar? Of course, it does. Because the people of ancient Mesopotamia were, in almost every meaningful sense, just people. Tired, confused, occasionally optimistic, mostly just trying to get through the day. So, dim the lights, close the curtains, turn on the fan if that's your thing, and let me walk you through a world that is simultaneously 4,000 years away and somehow deeply relatable. Mesopotamia. The word itself is Greek, which is a little ironic because the Greeks showed up thousands of years after the party had already started. It means land between the rivers, and those rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, were basically the entire reason any of this worked. They ran through what is now modern Iraq, and parts of Syria, Turkey, and Kuwait. And between them, they created this narrow strip of incredibly fertile land in an otherwise fairly arid region, which sounds lovely and peaceful, except that both rivers were famously unpredictable. They flooded when they felt like it. They changed course occasionally. They didn't ask anyone's permission because rivers famously don't care about your harvest schedule. And yet, people stayed. They kept coming back, kept building, kept planting. Because what those rivers gave you when they were in a good mood was extraordinary. Rich black soil, reliable water, the ability to grow food in quantities that could support not just a family, but a village, and then a town, and then eventually a city. And that right, there is where our story begins. With the slow, slightly chaotic, remarkably persistent process of people deciding to stop moving around and just stay somewhere, build something. Maybe argue about who owns the irrigation ditch. You know, civilization. The earliest settled communities in Mesopotamia began to appear somewhere around 10,000 BCE, though for most of our story tonight, we're going to be spending time in the period between roughly 4,000 and 500 BCE, which still covers an almost absurdly long stretch of human history. We're talking Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, and a few others who all took turns running the place with varying degrees of success and occasionally spectacular failure. But let's not rush. Let's start at the very beginning, or close enough to it. Imagine, and you can close your eyes for this part, actually, imagine a flat, wide plain, incredibly flat, famously flat. Like, you can see for miles and miles and the horizon just goes on forever, and the sky is enormous above you. It's hot, not pleasantly warm, hot, the kind of hot where everything shimmers a little and you start questioning your life choices by mid-morning. The rivers are somewhere nearby. You can hear them if you get close, and the land immediately around them is green and almost uncomfortably lush compared to the dry scrub that surrounds it. This is the world the first Mesopotamian settlers were working with. No natural fortifications, no mountains to hide behind, no forests to disappear into. Just flat, open land, two unpredictable rivers, and whatever you could build with your own hands. It's not the most naturally defensible geography in the world. In fact, it's about as vulnerable as you can get, which is probably why the history of Mesopotamia involves so many people invading it, because you could see the place coming from approximately 30 miles away, and there was very little anyone could do about that. The earliest major culture we know of in this region is the Ubaid people, who were doing their thing in Mesopotamia from around 6,500 to 3,800 BCE. They built the first true village settlements in the south, in a region that would eventually become known as Sumer. They farmed, they fished, they made pottery, actually quite nice pottery, painted with geometric designs, which suggests that even before writing in cities and kings, human beings looked at a functional clay pot and thought, yes, but what if it were also beautiful? Which is extremely relatable. The Ubaid people also began building the first temples. Not grand, soaring structures yet, those would come later, but elevated platforms, mudbrick sanctuaries, places set apart from the everyday world and dedicated to something larger than the immediate business of survival. This is, if you stop and think about it, remarkable. These are people living in small agricultural communities on the edge of a sometimes hostile river system, and they are still finding the time and the collective will to build something dedicated to the divine. Humans are, whatever else you might say about us, persistently interested in the transcendent. Even when the river is being difficult, even when the harvest is uncertain, something in us keeps looking up. The Ubaid settlements grew slowly. Villages became larger. Trade began, first local, then gradually reaching outward to surrounding regions. And then, somewhere around 4,000 to 3,500 BCE, something shifted. The settlements in southern Mesopotamia began to grow not just larger, but qualitatively different, more complex, more organized, more, and here is the word that historians reach for, urban. The world's first cities were being born, quietly, gradually, without any particular announcement, in the muddy flatlands between two rivers that didn't always behave themselves. The most famous of these early cities was Uruk, and Uruk, even by the standards of what came after it, was extraordinary. At its height, around 3000 BCE, Uruk may have had a population of somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 people. In a world where most human beings still lived in small farming villages, this was genuinely staggering. An 80,000 person city in 3000 BCE is the kind of thing that, when you really sit with it, kind of breaks your brain a little. That is a metropolis. That is a place with neighborhoods and specialists and administrators and priests and merchants and all the social infrastructure that comes with trying to organize tens of thousands of human beings who all have opinions and needs and the occasional dispute about property boundaries. And Uruk had all of that. It had monumental temple complexes, the most famous being dedicated to Inanna, the goddess of love and war, who we will get to later because she is genuinely one of the most interesting divine figures in the ancient world, and deserves her own paragraph. It had a city wall. It had a canal system. It had workshops producing pottery and textiles and metalwork at a scale that required coordination and specialization and record-keeping. Ah, record-keeping. This brings us to one of Mesopotamia's greatest gifts to the rest of human history: writing. The earliest writing we know of, anywhere in the world, comes from Uruk, dating to around 3200 BCE. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't a love letter. It wasn't a philosophical meditation on the nature of existence. It was accounting records, lists of goods, how much barley came in, how much oil went out, who owed what to whom, which is honestly so deeply human that it almost hurts. The first thing we wrote down as a species was essentially a spreadsheet. We invented one of the most transformative technologies in human history in order to keep track of inventory, which says something very specific about us as a species, though I'm not entirely sure what. These early writing tablets used a system of pictographs, small pictures representing objects or concepts. A drawing of a head meant head. A drawing of a bowl with lines meant rations. Over time, these pictographs were simplified and abstracted, and eventually they became the system we call cuneiform, named for the wedge-shaped marks made by pressing a reed stylus into soft clay. Cuneiform would go on to be used for thousands of years, adapted by multiple cultures and languages, and would eventually be used to write everything from administrative records to royal decrees, to legal codes to epic poetry, to personal letters to, yes, complaints about bad service. We actually have one of those. A clay tablet from around 1750 BCE, discovered at a site in what is now Iraq, on which a man named Nasir is absolutely roasted by a customer named Nani, who is furious about the quality of copper he received and the general disrespect he was shown as a client. It is 4,000 years old, and it reads like a strongly worded email that someone spent too long writing. Nani says, essentially, that this is not how you treat someone of his standing, that the copper was garbage, and that he expects better. Nasir apparently kept this tablet. We don't know why. Maybe he was saving it as evidence. Maybe he just forgot to throw it away. Maybe, on some level, he knew it was a keeper. But we are getting slightly ahead of ourselves. Let's float back a little to the basic texture of daily life in ancient Mesopotamia, because that is, after all, what tonight is really about. Not just the kings and the gods and the famous monuments, but the ordinary, quiet, slightly monotonous rhythm of everyday existence in a world that was still figuring itself out. Most people in ancient Mesopotamia were farmers. This is not a surprise. Most people in almost every ancient civilization were farmers, because growing food is the foundational activity that makes everything else possible. In Mesopotamia, farming meant working with the irrigation systems that channeled water from the rivers to the fields. It meant growing barley, the great staple crop of the region, along with wheat, lentils, chickpeas, onions, garlic, leeks, cucumbers, and a variety of other vegetables. It meant keeping animals, sheep and goats primarily, some cattle, pigs in certain periods, donkeys for transport. It was a life organized around seasons and water and the slow, demanding calendar of agricultural work. The farming villages of Mesopotamia were not glamorous places. Houses were built of mudbrick, sun-dried, not kiln-fired, because fuel was scarce on the flat, mostly treeless plain. Mudbrick is actually quite good building material in a dry climate. It's relatively easy to produce. It keeps interiors cool in the heat, and it's available basically everywhere because you just need mud, which the rivers provided in abundance. The problem is that it dissolves in water, which meant that when the rivers flooded, which they did regularly, enthusiastically, without warning, houses sometimes simply melted, which is a level of home maintenance stress that most of us, thankfully, don't have to deal with. A typical house in a Mesopotamian village or city would have been a simple rectangular structure, maybe a few rooms arranged around a central courtyard. The courtyard was important. It provided light, ventilation, a place for cooking and domestic activities, and a small degree of privacy from the busy street outside. Roofs were flat, made of wooden beams covered with reed matting, and then a layer of packed mud. People slept on rooftops in summer, because the interiors trapped heat and the flat roof offered a slight breeze and the comparative mercy of a slightly cooler night. Furniture was minimal. A platform or mat for sleeping, possibly a low table, storage vessels for grain and oil and water, a hearth, for cooking. The material possessions of an ordinary Mesopotamian household were not extensive, but they were practical, and they were, in many cases, quite carefully made. Pottery from Mesopotamia, even everyday household pottery, often shows real skill and attention. People cared about how things looked, even when those things were just containers for storing lentils. And on that gentle lentil-related note, let us pause for just a moment in our journey, because we have quite a long way to go tonight, and there's no hurry. The world of ancient Mesopotamia is patient. It has been waiting for us for several thousand years. It can wait a little longer. So, the Sumerians. Let's talk about the Sumerians. They are, in many ways, the people at the center of the earliest chapters of Mesopotamian history. They lived primarily in the southern part of the region, in a flat, hot, occasionally flooded landscape that they somehow turned into one of the most culturally productive environments the ancient world had ever seen. They built cities, not just Uruk, but also Nippur, Lagash, Eridu, Kish, and several others. Each of these cities was its own political entity, its own city-state, with its own patron deity, and its own king, and its own slightly different way of doing things, which, predictably, meant they were in more or less constant competition with each other. This is one of the recurring themes of Mesopotamian history: fragmentation. The region was rarely unified under a single ruler for very long. City-states squabbled, kingdoms rose and fell, empires assembled themselves through military conquest, and then fell apart when the next ambitious general came along, or when the administrative structure proved unable to hold everything together. It was not, by most measures, a politically stable region, but it was an extraordinarily productive one in terms of ideas, institutions, art, literature, and technology, and that productivity seems almost independent of who was technically in charge at any given moment. The Sumerian city-state was organized around the temple. In the earliest periods, the temple wasn't just a religious institution. It was also the economic and administrative center of the city. The priests and the temple administration managed land, organized agricultural labor, redistributed food rations to workers, maintained the irrigation systems, ran workshops, and kept records. Lots and lots of records. This is where cuneiform writing really came into its own, as a tool for managing the extraordinary logistical complexity of running a large temple economy. The main temple in a Sumerian city was often built on a raised platform called a ziggurat, not the massive multi-tiered ziggurats that you might have seen pictures of. Those came later, in the Babylonian and Assyrian periods, but still elevated structures, set apart from the surrounding city, visible from a distance. The temple at the top of the platform was the house of the city's patron deity. The god, in Sumerian thinking, literally lived there. The god owned the city and its land. The king served as the god's earthly representative, managing the deity's estate on their behalf. This is a theological framework that has some practical implications, because if the city belongs to the god and the king is just the manager, then the king is theoretically accountable to something higher than himself. He can't just do whatever he wants. He has religious obligations. He has to take care of the temples, maintain the rituals, keep the god happy. If things go wrong, a failed harvest, a military defeat, a flood, it might be interpreted as a sign that the king has not been managing the divine estate adequately, which is a kind of pressure that, say, being an absolute monarch with no religious accountability doesn't have. Sumerian kings were powerful, but they operated within a framework that constantly reminded them that they were not, themselves, gods. Not all of them took this as seriously as they should have, of course. But the framework was there. The actual day-to-day running of the temple complex, and by extension, much of the city, involved an enormous amount of administrative labor. Scribes recorded transactions. Overseers managed workers. Priests performed rituals and maintained the calendar of religious observances. The temple employed weavers, brewers, farmers, herders, construction workers, and countless others who received their wages in the form of rations. So much barley per day per month, depending on their position and skill level. This ration system was, for most ordinary people, the primary way they interacted with the big economic institutions of their city. You work, you get rations. The simplicity of it is almost elegant, even if the quantities weren't always generous. Barley, by the way, was to ancient Mesopotamia what money is to us. It was the medium of exchange, the unit of measurement, the thing you paid taxes in, the thing you were paid in, the thing you stored for hard times. Barley was life, in a very literal sense. And the management of barley, who grew it, who stored it, who distributed it, who was owed it, was one of the central administrative preoccupations of Mesopotamian civilization for thousands of years. Now, barley doesn't only become bread, it also becomes beer. And beer in ancient Mesopotamia was not a recreational luxury. It was a dietary staple. People of all classes, in all periods, drank beer. Workers received beer as part of their daily rations. Beer was safer to drink than water in many contexts, since fermentation kills a lot of the bacteria that make untreated water dangerous. It was also caloric, which mattered when physical labor was the dominant economic activity. The beer of ancient Mesopotamia was thick and grain-heavy, not the clear, sparkling thing we drink today. You often drank it through a straw to filter out the chunks of grain. There is, in fact, a hymn dedicated to Ninkasi, the Sumerian goddess of beer and brewing. It's a detailed, affectionate description of the brewing process, and it reads partly like a recipe. The Sumerians were serious about their beer. They had a goddess for it. That tells you everything. Life in a Sumerian city was, for most people, a life of work. Agricultural labor for those outside the city walls. Craft production, weaving, pottery, metalworking, leatherworking, for those within. Scribal work for the educated few who had gone through the long, demanding process of learning to read and write cuneiform, which was not something you could pick up casually. The Ajaba, or scribal school, was a serious institution. Students spent years practicing on clay tablets, copying texts, learning the hundreds of signs that cuneiform required, and being subjected to the supervision of teachers who, based on the tablets students left behind, were not notably patient or encouraging. We have student complaint tablets. We have a composition, sometimes called school days, in which a student describes his exhausting day at the Adaba, being beaten for being late, being beaten for talking, being beaten for his handwriting. It's relatable in the most depressing possible way. The family was the basic unit of Mesopotamian society, as it was in virtually every ancient civilization. And families in ancient Mesopotamia were organized in ways that will seem fairly recognizable, and in other ways that require a bit of context. Marriage was a legal contract, formalized in writing. Divorce was possible, though the terms depended heavily on the circumstances and the period. Women in Mesopotamia had legal rights. They could own property, engage in trade, appear in court, take loans. This varied by period and by social class, and it would be overly optimistic to suggest that ancient Mesopotamia was some kind of gender-equal paradise. It was not. But it was also not a society in which women were simply invisible or without agency. The evidence is too varied and too complex for simple conclusions. The law in ancient Mesopotamia was a serious matter. We'll talk more about the famous law codes, including Hammurabi's, a little later in our journey tonight. But even before those formal codifications, legal practice in Mesopotamian cities was well developed. Disputes were adjudicated. Contracts were recorded on clay tablets and witnessed by multiple parties. Loans were documented with interest rates and repayment terms. Property transfers were registered. The machinery of law ran constantly in these cities, because wherever you have large numbers of people interacting economically, you inevitably have disputes. And disputes require resolution, and resolution requires rules and someone empowered to enforce them. The courts in Mesopotamia generally consisted of a panel of judges, often local officials or respected elders, who heard testimony from both parties, examined documentary evidence when it existed, and rendered decisions. There was a genuine concept of evidence and testimony. There was also, in some circumstances, trial by ordeal, throwing someone into the river and seeing if they floated, which sounds like it needs a little work from an evidentiary standpoint. But even the ordeal was embedded in a legal framework that took the idea of determining truth seriously, even if the method leaves something to be desired. Ordinary people in ancient Mesopotamian cities lived close together, in houses that opened onto narrow streets, sharing walls with their neighbors. Privacy was relative. Noise traveled. The smells of cooking, of animals, of the river, of the workshop down the street, these were constant companions. Markets operated in the open spaces of the city. Merchants sold textiles, metals, dried fish, vegetables, pottery, jewelry. Trade was not limited to local goods. Mesopotamia imported enormous quantities of timber, scarce on the flat plain, stone, almost entirely absent, and metals, copper, tin, silver, gold, from distant regions. In return, they exported textiles and grain and manufactured goods. The Mesopotamian merchant was a real and important figure in the social landscape, traveling, negotiating, taking financial risks, keeping detailed records of transactions. There was in this world a sense of persistent uncertainty. Floods could ruin a harvest. Disease could sweep through a city. A rival city-state could decide to assert territorial claims with an army. The gods were real and present in Mesopotamian thought, not distant abstractions but active powers whose moods affected the weather, the harvest, the health of the body, the success of a journey. Every person had a personal god, a kind of divine patron whose goodwill had to be maintained through prayer and offering. If your life was going badly, if you were sick or poor or unlucky, one explanation was that your personal god had abandoned you, which put you in the uncomfortable position of trying to figure out what you had done to deserve abandonment. This sense of divine unpredictability runs through Mesopotamian religious thought in a way that distinguishes it somewhat from, say, later monotheistic traditions. The gods of Mesopotamia were not reliably benevolent. They were powerful, yes, and sometimes helpful, but they could also be arbitrary, petty, distracted, or simply indifferent. The Great Flood myth, which appears in multiple Mesopotamian texts, most famously in the Epic of Gilgamesh, tells of the gods deciding to destroy humanity because we were too noisy. Too noisy. The gods couldn't sleep because we kept making a racket, which, as divine motivations go, is not exactly morally sophisticated. But it does capture something real about the Mesopotamian sense that the universe does not owe you a good outcome, and that the powers governing existence are not necessarily organized around human flourishing. It was not a cheerful theology, but it was an honest one. In a landscape where floods happened, and crops failed, and people got sick, and no amount of piety could guarantee safety. The gods reflected the world as the Mesopotamians experienced it, powerful, sometimes generous, sometimes devastating, and never entirely predictable. And yet, and this is the part that always gets me, quietly, in the way that history sometimes does, people kept going. They kept building. They kept writing. They kept planting their barley and brewing their beer and arguing about their property boundaries and sending strongly worded letters to unscrupulous copper merchants. The anxiety about divine caprice was real, but so was the determination to live anyway, to make a home, to raise children, to make the pottery a little bit beautiful even when it didn't have to be. There is something genuinely comforting about that, if you let yourself sit with it. We have been worried and uncertain and persistent in the face of an unpredictable world for a very long time. The people of ancient Mesopotamia were worried 4,000 years ago, in houses made of sun-dried mud, under a sky full of gods who might flood the river whenever they felt like it. And they still got up in the morning. They still went to work. They still took the time to write down that EA Nayseer had sent them garbage copper, and they expected better. We are not so different. We never really were. Let's talk about the gods, because you cannot talk about ancient Mesopotamia without talking about the gods, and not just because they were everywhere and involved in everything, but because the Mesopotamian religious imagination was one of the most elaborate, detailed, and frankly entertaining theological systems the ancient world produced. These were not simple deities with simple portfolios. These were complex, contradictory, sometimes bickering divine personalities with rich mythological histories, family drama, grudges, and occasionally catastrophic decision-making. The Mesopotamian pantheon, the collection of major gods and goddesses, was large. In Sumerian tradition, there were three great gods who held the highest authority: Anu, god of the sky and the heavens; Enlil, god of wind and storms and the air between earth and sky; and Enki, known as Ea in the Akkadian tradition, god of wisdom, water, and magic. These three were the senior management of the divine world. And like a lot of senior management, they didn't always agree on policy. Anu was, theoretically, the father of the gods. He lived in the highest heaven. He was old and venerable, and somewhat remote, the kind of authority figure who is more symbolic than hands-on. In the myths, Anu rarely does the dirty work himself. He delegates. This is, in divine terms, quite a comfortable position to be in. Enlil was more actively involved in human affairs, and not always in ways that humans found pleasant. He was the god who decided to send the Great Flood. Again, because of the noise issue. Enlil was also associated with kingship and authority, and his temple at Nippur was one of the holiest sites in all of Mesopotamia, visited and honored by kings from every period of the region's history. Getting Enlil's approval for your kingship was, politically speaking, extremely useful. Annoying Enlil was less useful. Enki was, of all the major gods, the one who seems most sympathetically inclined toward humanity. He was the god of wisdom and fresh water, both of which were life-giving, and in the flood myth, it is Enki who quietly warns the one righteous man, Utnapishtim, to build a boat. He doesn't directly defy Enlil's decree, because that would be politically complicated. He just kind of whispers the information through the walls of the man's reed house. Technically, he only told the walls. The man just happened to overhear. This is divine plausible deniability, and it is honestly quite clever. Then there was Inanna. Oh, Inanna. Where to begin? Inanna was the Sumerian goddess of love, beauty, sex, desire, political power, and war. She was later identified with the Akkadian Ishtar. She was the most important goddess in the Mesopotamian pantheon, possibly the most widely worshipped deity in the entire ancient Near East at various points, and she was absolutely exhausting in the most magnificent possible way. Inanna's mythology is rich and strange and sometimes genuinely unsettling. She is described as a young woman of extraordinary beauty and ambition, always pursuing power, always wanting more, sometimes getting it, sometimes not. In one famous myth, she tricks the wise god Enki into giving her the me, the divine gifts that included things like kingship, priesthood, the scribal arts, the descent into the underworld, the ascent from the underworld, the standard of battle, the flood, the kindling of fire, and many other fundamental attributes of civilization. She gets Enki drunk and he hands them over, and then when he sobers up and realizes what he's given away, he tries to get them back. But Inanna is already on the boat, sailing home with her acquisitions, and his messenger ships can't catch her. She wins entirely through social engineering and the strategic deployment of alcohol. In another myth, one of the most remarkable pieces of ancient literature in existence, Inanna descends into the underworld to visit her sister Ereshkigal, who is the queen of the dead. The reasons for the visit are a little unclear, which is itself interesting. Possibly she wants to extend her power even into death, or possibly she wants to attend the funeral rites of Ereshkigal's dead husband. Either way, the underworld has rules. At each of the 7 gates, Inanna must remove a piece of her clothing or jewelry, her crown, her earrings, her beads, her breastplate, her bangles, her girdle, her robe. She arrives in the underworld naked, stripped of everything that marks her status and power, and Ereshkigal kills her. Her body is hung on a hook. Up above, the world starts to fall apart. Without Inanna, the goddess of desire and fertility, nothing wants to mate with anything. The animals aren't reproducing. The fields aren't being planted. The world is quietly dying. Fortunately, Inanna had planned ahead. She had instructed her servant Ninshubur to seek help if she didn't return. Ninshubur goes to Enlil, who says no. Goes to the moon god Nanna, who also says no bow. And then goes to Enki, who actually cares, and who comes up with an elaborate scheme involving 2 small beings created from the dirt under his fingernail, who can pass unnoticed through the gates of the underworld and deliver the food and water of life to revive Anna. It works, sort of. Inanna is revived, but the laws of the underworld are absolute. No one leaves without a substitute. She has to send someone to take her place. And who does she choose? Her husband, Dumuzi, who, while she was dead, apparently failed to mourn appropriately. He was sitting on his throne, dressed in his fine clothes, looking suspiciously comfortable for a man whose wife had recently been killed in the underworld. Inanna looks at him with what I can only imagine was an extremely specific expression, and she sends the demons to take him. It is not, ultimately, a cheerful myth, but it is a deeply human one. There is loss in it, and grief, and the terrifying way that death strips us of everything we thought defined us. There is also, clearly, a woman who had strong opinions about how one should behave during a spousal bereavement, and was prepared to act on those opinions. The gods of Mesopotamia were not just philosophical abstractions. They were narrative characters, with histories and relationships and consistent, if complicated, personalities. Knowing the myths wasn't just a matter of religious education, it was, in a sense, knowing how the world worked. Why does the moon wax and wane? Because of divine activities. Why does the spring flood come? Because of divine decisions. Why is the grain growing this year? Because someone's ritual was done correctly and the appropriate god was pleased. The myths weren't separate from life. They were the explanation of life, running underneath everything like groundwater. The priests and priestesses who served the gods were, accordingly, important figures. Temple rituals were elaborate and constant. Daily offerings, festival observances, the care and clothing and feeding of the divine statue that represented the god's presence in the temple. The statue needed to be bathed, dressed, fed, and put to bed. Because the god literally lived in the statue, and you didn't let your gods go hungry or sleep in dirty clothes if you could help it. Some of the highest-ranking priestesses occupied positions of extraordinary religious and social importance. The priestess at Ur, for example, was typically a daughter of the king, appointed to serve as the earthly representative of the god Nana, the moon god. She lived in a special complex within the temple. She participated in ritual marriage ceremonies, the hieros gamos, that symbolically united the divine with the human and was believed to ensure fertility and prosperity for the land. The most famous priestess in history is Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, who lived in the late 3rd millennium BCE, and who is remarkably the earliest author in human history, whose name we know. She wrote hymns to Inanna. They are beautiful, and they are personal, and they speak of devotion and grief and the experience of being exiled from one's sacred role. She was a real person. Her words are still readable today. That is something. Temples were also, in certain periods and cities, home to women called Naditu, a class of dedicated women who were attached to the temple, often daughters of wealthy families, who lived in a kind of cloister within the temple complex. They could own property, engage in business, inherit from their families. They could not marry in the conventional sense, though in some periods they could have a secondary wife, serve as a kind of domestic partner. Their lives were constrained, but not without agency. The Naditu community at Sippar, dedicated to the sun god Shamash, was particularly active in the old Babylonian period. We have records of Naditu women making loans, owning houses, managing investments. They were, in their way, a class of economically active professional women operating within the framework of religious dedication. Magic in ancient Mesopotamia was real. Not real in the sense that it actually produced the effects claimed for it, but real in the sense that it was a genuine, institutionalized practice with its own specialists, its own texts, its own social legitimacy. The Ishipu, or exorcist, was a respected professional who dealt with supernatural causes of illness and misfortune. The Biru, or diviner, read omens, examining the livers of sacrificed animals, observing the stars, noting unusual events, and interpreted their meaning for kings and ordinary people alike. Divination in particular was a serious science in ancient Mesopotamia, practiced with enormous care and documented in vast omen series that cataloged possible signs and their interpretations. The liver was particularly important for divination. The idea was that when you sacrificed an animal and examined its liver, you were reading a message from the gods encoded in the organ's physical characteristics. Clay models of sheep livers have been found, marked with the sectors of the organ and their corresponding omens, apparently used as teaching tools. So, somewhere in ancient Mesopotamia, there were divination schools where students learned to read sheep livers, and there were standardized liver models to help them practice. This is a very specific thing to know about a civilization, and I find it genuinely charming. Omens were everywhere. If a dog urinated on someone's belongings, that was an omen. If an owl landed on someone's house, that was an omen. If a woman gave birth to twins or to a child with unusual features, that was an omen. If an eclipse occurred, that was an extremely serious omen and required immediate attention from trained specialists and possibly some emergency royal rituals. The world was saturated with meaning, constantly sending signals to those trained to read it. This could be comforting. The universe is not indifferent. It is communicating. Or it could be terrifying, because what if the signals were bad? What did it mean if the eclipse happened on a Tuesday? What if the liver had a suspicious spot on the left lobe? The answer to what it meant was, it depends. Omen interpretation was not mechanical. It required training and judgment, and frankly, a certain amount of wiggle room. Two omens might point in different directions. An unfavorable omen might be counteracted by an appropriate ritual. The system was responsive to human anxiety in a way that pure fate would not be. You could do something. You could perform the ritual, make the offering, say the prayer. You might not be able to prevent every bad thing, but you were not simply helpless. This, I think, is the emotional core of Mesopotamian religious practice. Not the theology or the mythology or the complex organizational structures of the temples, though all of those are fascinating, but the sense that human beings could engage with the forces governing their world, could communicate, could attempt to negotiate, could, through correct behavior and proper ritual, maintain a working relationship with the divine powers that controlled everything from the weather to the health of their children. It was exhausting, probably. It was also, in its way, deeply human. We still do this, don't we? We knock on wood. Oh, wood. We avoid walking under ladders. We notice when things go wrong and look for patterns, for causes, for something we did or didn't do that might have invited the misfortune. The specific forms have changed almost beyond recognition. The underlying impulse has not changed at all. We are the same anxious, pattern-seeking, ritual-performing creatures that we have always been. We are the heirs of the Ishipu and the Biru and the worried farmer staring at an unfavorable liver, trying to figure out what the universe is trying to tell us and what, if anything, we can do about it. The gods of Mesopotamia have been silent for a very long time. Their temples are dust. Their statues are in museums. Their myths survive only in fragments on clay tablets that scholars spend careers carefully deciphering. But they were real to the people who lived with them, as real as anything can be. And the people who lived with them were real too. Complicated, worried, hopeful, creative, persistent. Just like us. Let's take a gentle breath and then move onward. There's a king we need to talk about. Around 2334 BCE, give or take a few years, because ancient dating is always a little approximate. A man named Sargon became king of a city called Akkad, and proceeded to conquer most of Mesopotamia, in a way that no one had quite managed before. Sargon died. The name itself became legendary, so legendary that later Mesopotamian kings actually named themselves Sargon as a tribute, because branding in the ancient world worked in interesting ways. The historical Sargon, Sargon of Akkad, to distinguish him from the later Sargons, is one of those figures who exists at the blurry edge between history and myth, where the documentary evidence is tangled up with later legendary elaboration to a degree that makes it difficult to be entirely certain what's what. But certain things seem reasonably clear. He was, by the standards of his time, a genuinely remarkable military and administrative figure. Before Sargon, Mesopotamia was a collection of competing city-states, Sumerian cities mostly, each with its own king, fighting each other, forming alliances, breaking alliances, and generally failing to produce anything like political unity for the region as a whole. Sargon changed this. Over a period of military campaigns, he brought the Sumerian city-states under his control, and then, significantly, kept going. He pushed north into what is now Syria, east into Elam, and possibly even further. He created, in essence, the world's first territorial empire. This is not a small thing. Empire requires infrastructure. roads, communication systems, administrative personnel, tax collection, the ability to project power over long distances. Sargon built all of this, or at least began to build it. He placed his own people, often members of his family, in positions of authority and conquered cities. He standardized certain aspects of administration. He created a standing army, which was itself something of an innovation in a world where military forces were often assembled for specific campaigns and then disbanded. The legendary biography of Sargon is almost certainly shaped by later myth-making, but it's interesting enough to mention. According to later tradition, Sargon was of humble or even obscure origin, a child placed in a basket and set adrift on a river, a story that will strike students of Hebrew scripture as familiar, discovered and raised by a gardener who eventually came to the attention of Inanna and rose through the ranks to power. The basket on the river origin story is, scholars note, a classic foundational myth for powerful figures, the humble beginning that makes the eventual greatness more remarkable. Whether it reflects anything real about Sargon's actual origins is impossible to say. What we can say is that someone thought it was important to tell this story about him, which tells us something about how he was remembered. His daughter Enheduanna, whom I mentioned earlier, is perhaps the most remarkable thing Sargon left behind. He appointed her as an priestess at the highest female religious office in Sumer, in what was clearly a deliberate political move, designed to integrate Akkadian power into the existing Sumerian religious framework. It was shrewd. It acknowledged the importance of the Sumerian sacred tradition while placing a member of his own family at its center. Whether Enheduanna herself saw it primarily as a political appointment or as a genuine religious vocation, we can't know. But the hymns she wrote suggest someone with real faith, real feeling, and a real writer's relationship with language. She wasn't just performing a role. She was thinking and feeling and putting it into words. The Akkadian Empire after Sargon continued under his sons, and then his grandson Naram-Sin, who was arguably even more militarily aggressive, and who made the interesting theological decision to declare himself a god while still living. This was unusual. Mesopotamian kings were generally not gods. They were servants of the gods, representatives of the gods, chosen by the gods, but not actually divine themselves. Naram-Sin looked at this convention and decided it didn't apply to him. He added the divine determinative to his name and inscriptions, a small sign that in cuneiform writing indicated that the following word referred to a deity. He called himself King of the Four Quarters, meaning ruler of the entire world. He wore a horned helmet, the symbol of divinity, in his official representations. This is, to put it gently, a bold move. And like many bold moves in Mesopotamian history, it did not entirely work out. Later Mesopotamian tradition retrospectively attributed the fall of the Akkadian Empire to the impiety of Naram-Sin, specifically to his sack of the holy city of Nippur and the desecration of Enlil's temple there. Whether this was the actual cause of the empire's decline or a later narrative imposed on events is debatable. Empires fall for many reasons, but the Mesopotamians preferred the theological explanation. You don't sack Nippur. You just don't. And if you do, consequences follow. This is presented not as irony, but as cosmic order reasserting itself. The Akkadian Empire collapsed around 2154 BCE Dawa. The reasons were probably multiple: internal rebellions, overextension, pressure from outside groups, possibly a period of drought and agricultural failure that destabilized the food supply. A group called the Gudians, described in Mesopotamian sources with considerable hostility, which probably tells us more about the sources than about the Gudians themselves, are traditionally credited with bringing down the empire. What followed was a period of fragmentation and regional autonomy. And then, because Mesopotamian history is nothing if not cyclical, unity reasserted itself. The third dynasty of Ur, established around 2112 BCE under a king named Ur-Nama, and brought to its greatest extent under his son Shulgi, created what is sometimes called the Ur-Uri state, a highly centralized, bureaucratically intensive political system that in some ways out-administered even the Akkadian Empire. The Ur-III state produced extraordinary quantities of administrative records. We have hundreds of thousands of tablets from this period. Well, ration lists, labor accounts, animal counts, agricultural records, correspondence between officials. If the Ur-III state ran out of things to record, they probably would have started recording the absence of things to record. Shulgi himself is a fascinating figure. He was king for nearly 50 years, which is a very long time to be running anything. He declared himself divine like Naram Sin before him. He was, if his own inscriptions are to be believed, a paragon of athletic, intellectual, and martial virtue. He claimed to have run from Nippur to Ur and back, a distance of about 160 miles, in a single day, in order to celebrate 2 festivals. This is an extraordinarily specific claim. Whether it's true is a question I will leave to you. He was also, by his own account, a scholar who had mastered the scribal arts, a musician, a hunter, and a military genius. One suspects the inscriptions may have been written by people whose continued employment depended on their generosity in such assessments. But even allowing for royal self-promotion, Shulgi's reign seems to have been genuinely productive. He standardized weights and measures, enormously important for trade and taxation. He created or expanded the Ajuba scribal schools. He organized the state's agricultural and herding operations with remarkable efficiency. The Ur-III state was, in many ways, a demonstration of what a sufficiently determined bureaucracy could accomplish in terms of organizing a complex economy. It also demonstrates, with equal clarity, that no amount of bureaucratic efficiency prevents political collapse. The Ur-III state fell around 2004 BCE, brought down by economic strain and military pressure from groups pushing in from the west and east. The great city of Ur was sacked. Ibisin, the last Ur-III king, was taken captive to Elam. A lament was composed for the destruction of the city. It is one of the most moving pieces of ancient literature we have, a grief-stricken song about a city abandoned by its protective deity, about walls broken and temples destroyed, and people led away in captivity. It reads, 4,000 years later, as fresh as a wound. The goddess Ningal, patron of Ur, pleads with the divine assembly to spare the city. They refuse. The decision has been made. The destruction of Ur is decreed. Ningal's grief is described with painful specificity. She tears at her hair. She weeps. She paces the city knowing what is coming. The city falls. The lament ends not with consolation but with a kind of exhausted resignation. It happened. The city weeps. The people weep. And life eventually goes on. Because in Mesopotamia, life always went on. Ur was destroyed, and then Ur was rebuilt. This happened more than once in the city's history. The capacity for destruction and the capacity for reconstruction existed side by side, as they always do in places where people have decided they are staying no matter what. Let us move on now to a period that gives us one of history's most famous legal documents, and a king whose name, even now, most people recognize. Let's talk about Hammurabi. Hammurabi was the sixth king of the first dynasty of Babylon, and he ruled from approximately 1792 to 1750 BCE. That's about 42 years, which is respectable by any measure. He came to power when Babylon was a fairly minor city-state in central Mesopotamia, not particularly important in the grand scheme of things. He left it as the dominant power in the region. This transformation was not accidental. Hammurabi was, by all available evidence, an extremely capable political and military operator. He was patient. He spent the first several decades of his reign consolidating his position, managing alliances, and waiting for opportunities rather than rushing into expensive military adventures. And then, in the later part of his reign, he went to work. He defeated the powerful kingdom of Eshnunna. He brought down Mari, one of the great cities of the Middle Euphrates. He defeated Larsa in the south. By the time he was done, he controlled most of Mesopotamia. But Hammurabi is not famous primarily for his military campaigns. He is famous for his law code, or more precisely, for the stele, the large stone monument discovered in 1901 by French archaeologists at the site of ancient Susa, where it had been taken as war booty by a later Elamite king, carved with nearly 300 laws preceded by a lengthy prologue and followed by an epilogue. The Code of Hammurabi. Now, before we talk about the laws themselves, let's gently complicate the word code. The text is often called a law code, which implies something like a comprehensive legal system, a complete set of rules governing all aspects of social life. Scholars debate whether that's quite the right framing. The text seems to be more of a collection of legal decisions and precedents, exemplary cases that demonstrate how a wise and just king handles disputes, rather than an exhaustive legal code in the modern sense. It doesn't cover everything. There are obvious gaps. Many situations that must have arisen in real legal practice are simply not addressed. What it is, among other things, is a piece of royal propaganda. The prologue makes this explicit. Hammurabi presents himself as chosen by the gods to bring justice to the land, to protect the weak from the powerful, to be the shepherd of his people. The laws that follow are evidence of this divine mandate. By inscribing them on a giant stone stele and placing it in public, presumably so that literate people could read it, or have it read to them, Hammurabi is announcing his identity as a just king. He is not just a conqueror, he is a lawgiver. And lawgivers, in ancient Mesopotamia, were next to gods. The image at the top of the stele shows Hammurabi standing before Shamash, the sun god and god of justice, receiving the symbols of authority. It is a statement of legitimacy. The laws come from the god, through the king. To defy the law is not merely to defy Hammurabi. It is to defy Shamash. So, what are the laws? They cover a remarkable range of everyday situations. Trade, property, new, one say, inheritance, marriage and divorce, assault, theft, agricultural disputes, professional conduct, the rates that surgeons could charge for successful operations and the penalties for unsuccessful ones. Building standards and what happened if a house you built collapsed and killed the owner's son. Answer: your son died, which is a form of liability that modern construction law has not adopted. The most famous principle associated with the code, the eye for an eye concept, is actually described in the original Babylonian as lex talionis, the law of equivalence. If a man puts out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. If a man breaks the bone of another man, his bone shall be broken. This sounds brutal, and in isolation it is. But in context, it was actually a limiting principle. The point was not to encourage violence, but to prevent escalation. If you injure me, I may only injure you equivalently, not kill you, not destroy your entire family, not take all your property. The response must be proportionate. This was in a social environment where blood feuds and disproportionate retaliation were genuine risks, actually a moderating force. There is also a significant class dimension to the laws, which is important not to paper over. The penalties in Hammurabi's code differ depending on the social status of the parties involved. There are three broad classes: the Olim, free citizens of the upper class; the Mushknum, a kind of middle or dependent class; and the Wardum, slaves. An offense against an Olim is punished more severely than the same offense against a Mushknum, and an offense against a slave is handled differently again. The law is not blind to social status. It is very much aware of it, and it encodes those distinctions directly into the penalties. This doesn't make Hammurabi a monster by ancient standards. He was a man of his time, operating within the social assumptions of his world, and the class-based legal system was not unusual in the ancient Near East. But it's worth noting, because it complicates the narrative of the code as a document of universal justice. It is a document of justice within a specific social framework, which is a rather different thing. Some of the individual laws are genuinely fascinating in their specificity. There are provisions governing tavern keepers, specifically female tavern keepers, who were apparently a recognized professional class. If a tavern keeper allows criminals to gather in her establishment without reporting them to the authorities, she shall be put to death. This suggests that taverns were known gathering points for people planning illegal activities, which is historically consistent, and also honestly not that surprising. There are also provisions about what happens if a tavern keeper gives short measure on beer. The customer can throw her in the water, which is perhaps more direct than a Yelp review, but conveys a similar level of grievance. There are laws governing adoption, which was practiced in ancient Mesopotamia, and evidently created legal complications that needed to be addressed. If an artisan takes a child to raise and teach his craft, and the child later wants to return to his birth father, the artisan can keep the child. The logic seems to be that the investment in education creates a claim on the child. This is uncomfortable by modern standards, but it reflects a world where professional skills were family property, passed down carefully, and where the investment in training someone was genuinely significant. There are laws governing marriage and what happens when a marriage breaks down. A woman can divorce her husband if she has not been negligent, or if he has been going out too much. There is a phrase that translates approximately as going around excessively and neglecting her seriously, which captures a very specific domestic grievance. She can take her dowry and return to her father's house. But if she has been a bad wife, if she has been gadding about according to some translations, she can be thrown in the water. The standards are, as you may have noticed, not perfectly symmetrical between genders. Hammurabi's code also contains some of the earliest provisions governing medical practice. A surgeon who performs a successful operation can charge a set fee. A surgeon who performs an operation that kills the patient or destroys the patient's eye has his hand cut off. This is obviously an extremely powerful professional incentive for careful surgical practice, and also possibly a disincentive to take on risky cases, which might actually be bad for public health outcomes. The law, as ever, has unintended consequences. The epilogue of the code is almost as remarkable as the laws themselves. Hammurabi addresses future kings, and he seems to know that he's writing for posterity, and tells them that if they are just and follow his laws, they will prosper. And if they are unjust, if they alter his inscriptions, if they neglect the welfare of his people, then the great gods will curse them with a spectacular array of misfortunes that takes up quite a lot of stone and is impressively comprehensive in its scope. He curses them with famine, darkness, military defeat, the weeping of their subjects, an evil fate, and the extinction of their name from human memory. It is, as curses go, fairly thorough. Hammurabi died around 1750 BCE, and the dynasty he had made great did not long survive him. His successors faced pressure on multiple fronts: internal revolts, external threats, the general difficulty of maintaining a large empire with ancient administrative technology. Around 1595 BCE, the Hittites, a powerful people from what is now Turkey, swept down into Mesopotamia and sacked Babylon. They didn't stay, but the disruption was enough to end the first dynasty. Babylon would eventually recover and become great again, but not yet. In the meantime, let's turn our attention to the ordinary people of this Babylonian world, because while Hammurabi was inscribing his laws and the gods were being duly propitiated, and the empire was doing what empires do, there were also just regular people, going about their regular lives in their mud-brick houses, with their barley and their beer and their personal gods, and their complicated family situation. The Old Babylonian period, the era of Hammurabi and his immediate predecessors and successors, is actually quite well documented at the level of ordinary life, because we have enormous quantities of private archive tablets from this period. Contracts, letters, legal records, business documents, all the paperwork of daily existence, preserved in clay, and they give us a remarkably vivid picture of people who are recognizably human, even across 4,000 years. We have letters from merchants complaining about unreliable partners, letters from sons to fathers asking for more money, and the fathers' responses, which range from sympathetic to very much not. Letters between sisters sharing family gossip, contracts for the hire of boats, for the purchase of fields, for the leasing of houses. A letter from a woman to her absent husband telling him in some detail what she thinks about his failure to send money home. A letter from a father to his son that essentially says, "I have heard that you are not behaving yourself at school, and I am extremely disappointed in you, and your grandfather would be ashamed. And what were you thinking?" These people are not exotic. They are not alien. They are worried about money and family and reputation and the future. They love their children and are sometimes exasperated by them. They trust some of their business partners and not others. They negotiate. They argue. They comfort each other. They complain. They are, underneath all the ancient context, just people. And that is something worth carrying with you as we continue our journey through Mesopotamia tonight, through the Assyrians and the later Babylonians, and the extraordinary final chapter of this civilization's history. These were not symbols. They were not abstractions. They were people, tired, complicated, persistent people, living in a difficult world doing their best, which is, honestly, all any of us are doing. Let's keep going. The Assyrians. Okay, so the Assyrians. Let me be upfront with you. The Assyrians have a reputation. In ancient sources, biblical, Babylonian, Greek, they are described as fearsome, ruthless, the kind of military power that other people wrote nightmare-adjacent poetry about. The Book of Nahum in the Hebrew Bible is essentially an extended taunt celebrating the fall of the Assyrian capital Nineveh, which tells you something about how the Assyrians were perceived by their neighbors. And the Assyrians, for their part, were not exactly trying to soften that image. Their royal inscriptions are detailed, enthusiastic, and remarkably specific about what happened to people who opposed them. But the Assyrians were also builders, scholars, and administrators of genuine capability. Their capital cities, Ashur, Nineveh, Nimrud, Khorsabad, were extraordinary places, filled with monumental architecture, elaborate sculpture, and extensive libraries. Nineveh, under the king Ashurbanipal, in the 7th century BCE, housed one of the greatest libraries of the ancient world, containing tens of thousands of clay tablets covering everything from myth and epic to medical texts to astronomical observations to the royal correspondence of previous centuries. It was a deliberate, systematic collection of knowledge, assembled because Ashurbanipal was genuinely interested in learning, which is a side of Assyrian royal character that the fearsome warrior reputation tends to overshadow. So, let's hold both things at once. A civilization that was capable of extraordinary violence and one that was capable of extraordinary intellectual achievement. Because human beings, then as now, are fully capable of being both. The Assyrian heartland was in the north of Mesopotamia, centered on the city of Ashur on the Tigris River. The city itself was named for the god Ashur, or possibly the other way around. The relationship between city and deity in this case is somewhat circular. And Ashur was the supreme god of the Assyrian state, whose honor the king was obligated to uphold and extend. This gave Assyrian military expansion a theological dimension. Conquering new territories was, in a sense, extending the domain of Ashur, which is a useful framing if you are a king who wants to conquer things and also wants to feel good about it. The Assyrian Empire went through several phases of expansion and contraction over a long history. There is an Old Assyrian period, a Middle Assyrian period, and a Neo-Assyrian period, and the divisions between them reflect real shifts in power and territorial extent. For our purposes tonight, let's focus primarily on the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which ran from around 911 to 609 BCE and represents the fullest expression of Assyrian imperial ambition. The Neo-Assyrian kings, figures like Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, yes, named after the old Sargon, for reasons of branding, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, and Ashurbanipal, built an empire that at its height extended from Egypt in the southwest to the Persian Gulf in the southeast to the mountains of what is now Iran and Turkey in the north and east. This was the largest empire the ancient Near East had yet produced. Managing it required sophisticated administrative machinery, regular military campaigns to keep restless subjects in line, and a level of logistical organization that was, for its time, genuinely impressive. The Assyrian army was the instrument of all this, and it was in many respects the most professional and effective military force of its era. The Assyrians developed and refined techniques for siege warfare that allowed them to take walled cities that might otherwise have been able to hold out indefinitely. They used battering rams, siege ramps, tunneling, psychological pressure, and when they took a city after a prolonged siege, they made a public example of the inhabitants in ways that were intended to encourage other cities to surrender promptly rather than resist. This was explicit policy. The logic was, if resistance costs you everything and surrender means you get to live, mostly, then cities should surrender. And many did. Assyrian royal inscriptions describe the aftermath of military campaigns with a directness that is striking even by ancient standards. Deportations, the forced resettlement of conquered populations, were a standard Assyrian policy tool. Large groups of people from conquered regions were moved to other parts of the empire, and populations from other regions were moved in to replace them. This served multiple purposes. It broke up local power structures, dispersed potential rebels, provided labor for building projects and agricultural expansion in underpopulated areas, and mixed populations in ways that made regional identity harder to maintain. The Israelites taken to Babylon, the famous Babylonian captivity, actually carried out in stages by the Babylonians who came after the Assyrians, is probably the most famous example of this kind of forced population movement. But the Assyrians practiced it extensively before the Babylonians took it over. The effect on the people subjected to deportation was devastating. We have fragmentary evidence of what this meant for ordinary families. The separation, the journey, the arrival in an unfamiliar place, the attempt to rebuild a life in alien surroundings. Some deported populations assimilated over generations. Some maintained distinct cultural identities for centuries. The psychological and social cost was immense, and it was not incidental to Assyrian policy, it was the point. And yet, the Assyrians also built. Sennacherib, one of the most feared of the Assyrian kings, was also responsible for the construction of Nineveh as a major royal capital, a city of extraordinary ambition. He describes his palace, the palace without rival, as he called it with characteristic modesty, in inscriptions that detail the exotic timbers, the exotic stones, the relief sculptures, the gardens. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, might, according to some scholars, actually have been the gardens of Sennacherib's Nineveh. The evidence is debated, but the possibility is interesting, not least because it would mean that one of the most famous wonders of the ancient world was misattributed for 2.5 millennia. Sennacherib's son Esarhaddon was in some ways an even more interesting figure. He suffered from persistent health problems throughout his reign, which ancient sources record in detail, and which the royal medical establishment, Assyrian kings had access to the best physicians and diviners of the age, frantically tried to address. He was also, despite, or perhaps because of, his own frailty, an effective military commander who reconquered Egypt, which the Assyrians had lost, and who generally managed to hold the empire together through a combination of military force and diplomatic skill. He was also, if the Omen texts are to be believed, extremely anxious. The Assyrian royal archives from Nineveh include a fascinating correspondence between Esarhaddon and his court scholars, astronomers, diviners, physicians, who wrote to him regularly with omen interpretations and advice. These letters give us an intimate glimpse of the royal anxiety machine, a king surrounded by specialists whose job was to read the signs of the universe and tell him what they meant, and a king who took those readings very seriously and wanted to know everything they had to say about his health, his campaigns, and the general state of divine favor. When an eclipse occurred, the diviners would write to the king explaining what it meant and what rituals needed to be performed. There was even a practice called the substitute king. During certain dangerous omen periods, a stand-in would be put on the throne, dressed in royal robes, treated as king for the duration of the omen period, and then, at the end, would be killed so that any evil that had been predicted for the king would fall on the substitute instead. The real king would be living quietly somewhere else under a different name during this period. This practice is documented. It happened. Someone had this job. Multiple someones, probably, given that the position was not known for longevity. If you were the substitute king, the options for negotiating your employment terms were presumably limited. Ashurbanipal, who ruled from 668 to about 627 BCE, is in some ways the most fully realized character among the Assyrian kings, partly because we have so much material from his reign, including extensive royal inscriptions in which he presents himself in detail, the library he assembled, and the famous lion hunt reliefs from his palace at Nineveh. These reliefs, now in the British Museum, are extraordinary works of art. They show lions being released from cages, hunted by the king from a chariot, wounded and dying. The lions are rendered with an empathy and precision that is remarkable. You can see individual lions in pain, snarling, dragging injured hindquarters. The artist, unnamed of course, was looking at those animals and seeing their suffering and putting it on stone with genuine feeling. Ashurbanipal presented the lion hunt as a demonstration of royal virtue, the king as master of the wild protector of his people from dangerous animals. But the lions were captive, released for the hunt in a controlled environment. It was theater. And there is something in the way those relief carvings render the lions that suggests the artist, at least, was aware of the tragedy in it. The Neo-Assyrian Empire fell with startling speed. Ashurbanipal's reign, whatever its accomplishments, was followed by succession struggles and internal conflict. External pressure from the Medes, a people from what is now northwestern Iran, and from the Babylonians, who had been subjects of Assyria and were distinctly tired of it, mounted steadily. In 612 BCE, Nineveh fell to a coalition of Medes and Babylonians. The great city, home of Ashurbanipal's library, of Sennacherib's palace, of decades of accumulated imperial power, was destroyed. A short while later, the Assyrian state itself ceased to exist. The relief with which neighboring peoples greeted this development is documented in those biblical texts I mentioned. Nahum literally celebrates. The city of Nineveh, which had survived for centuries and had been one of the most powerful urban centers in the world, was buried under the desert. When the Greek soldier historian Xenophon marched past the ruins in 401 BCE, less than 200 years after Nineveh's fall, he didn't know what city the ruins were. The site was so thoroughly abandoned that even its name had been lost. It was rediscovered by archaeologists in the 19th century CEOIC. The speed of imperial collapse and the completeness of forgetting that can follow is one of the quietly vertiginous things that ancient history teaches you. Nineveh was one of the greatest cities in the world. Within 2 centuries, nobody knew its name. This is something to sit with at 3 in the morning when you're thinking about the permanence of things. Let's float on gently to Babylon again, because Babylon gets another chapter, and it's a good one. After Nineveh fell, the balance of power in Mesopotamia shifted to Babylon. The Babylonians, liberated from Assyrian dominance, proceeded to construct a new empire, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which lasted from 626 to 539 BCE and produced in its brief existence some of the most memorable architecture and the most dramatic royal figures in Mesopotamian history. The most famous of these figures was Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled from 605 to 562 BCE, and who managed to be simultaneously one of the great builders of the ancient world and the villain of multiple biblical narratives. He is the king who destroyed Jerusalem and carried the Jews into captivity in Babylon. He is the king who, in the book of Daniel, had dreams that his court magicians couldn't interpret. He is also, according to the book of Daniel, the king who went mad and ate grass like an ox for 7 years, which is a detail specific enough to suggest some basis in reality, possibly a serious mental illness or extended period of incapacitation, though the exact nature of whatever happened to him remains a subject of scholarly discussion. But let's start with what he built. Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar was a genuinely extraordinary city. Ancient sources consistently describe it as one of the great wonders of the world, not just in rhetoric but in documented detail. The city had massive defensive walls. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing about a century after Nebuchadnezzar's time, describes them as enormously wide and tall, wide enough for chariots to drive on top. Whether Herodotus's specific numbers are accurate is debated, but the walls were real and substantial. The city was entered through monumental gates, the most famous of which, the Ishtar Gate, was decorated with glazed brick reliefs of animals sacred to Marduk and Ishtar, lions, bulls, and the Mushushu, a mythological dragon-like creature that is one of the most immediately recognizable symbols of ancient Babylon. The Ishtar Gate has been partially reconstructed and is now in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, and it is genuinely breathtaking. Vivid blue and gold animal figures in procession, the whole thing vibrating with color and intention. Walking through a reconstruction of it, you begin to understand something about the effect it must have had on someone approaching Babylon for the first time. This was a city that wanted you to understand, before you were even inside, that you were somewhere important. Nebuchadnezzar's palace complex within the city was enormous. His inscriptions describe it in the language of superlatives that Mesopotamian kings defaulted to. The greatest, the most beautiful, the most magnificent. He brought cedars from Lebanon for the roof beams. He brought exotic stones from distant mountains. He employed craftsmen from across the empire. Whether he also built the Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, is, as I noted earlier, disputed. The gardens are not mentioned in his own inscriptions, which is a strange omission if he built something that spectacular. But some ancient sources do place them in Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar was certainly capable of the ambition required to build such a thing. The great ziggurat of Babylon, Etemenanki, house of the foundation of heaven and earth, was one of the defining monuments of the ancient world. It rose in multiple stages, the topmost shrine dedicated to Marduk, the chief god of Babylon. Etemenanki is often identified with the biblical Tower of Babel, which is linguistically plausible. Babel is simply Babylon in Hebrew. The biblical account presents it as a symbol of human hubris, a tower built to reach the heavens, brought down by divine intervention. From a Babylonian perspective, it was simply the house of the god, the appropriate dwelling for the divine presence at the center of the world. Marduk, by the way, had risen to prominence through a process of theological promotion that is interesting in its own right. He was originally a relatively minor deity, the patron god of Babylon. As Babylon's political power grew during the Babylonian dynasties of the early 2nd millennium BCE, Marduk's divine status grew with it. By the time of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, he was unambiguously the king of the gods, the one who defeated the primordial chaos monster Tiamat and created the world from her body, a myth told in the Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, which was recited at the New Year festival each year as an affirmation of cosmic order and Marduk's supremacy. The New Year festival, the Akitu, was one of the most important religious celebrations in ancient Babylon. It lasted for 12 days and involved elaborate rituals, processions, and the ritual humiliation of the king. Yes, the humiliation of the king. The high priest of Marduk would slap the king's face, pull his ears, and force him to kneel before the god's statue and declare that he had not sinned, had not neglected the city, had not struck any cheek of any protected person. If the king wept during this, that was a good sign. The god was satisfied with his contrition, and then the king would receive back his regalia and his royal dignity, and Marduk would renew the cosmic order for another year. It was a ritual of humbling and restoration, a reminder that even the mightiest king existed within a framework of divine authority that outranked him entirely. Even Nebuchadnezzar had to get slapped once a year. There is something quietly satisfying about that. Babylon was also, under Nebuchadnezzar, a city of enormous cultural diversity. The deportations that had brought people from conquered territories, including the Judeans of the famous Babylonian captivity, created a city full of people from different cultural backgrounds, speaking different languages, practicing different religious traditions. This is not to romanticize the circumstances that brought them there. Being deported is not a pleasant experience, and the grief of the exiled Judeans is documented in extraordinary literature that has shaped Western religious thought for 2.5 millennia. But within Babylon, there seems to have been a degree of tolerance for religious and cultural difference that enabled exiled communities to maintain their identities while also participating in Babylonian economic and social life. Some of the deported Judeans prospered in Babylon. Some rose to positions of prominence. Their community maintained itself, maintained its traditions, and eventually, when the Persians allowed it, returned to Judah. The cultural and theological development that happened in exile shaped Judaism in ways that are still felt today. Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BCE, and his successors were, without exception, unable to maintain either his military achievements or his political stability. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, so recently triumphant, began to unravel almost immediately. There were succession disputes. There was a king named Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon, who has the distinction of being one of the strangest rulers in Mesopotamian history. A man who spent years away from Babylon, in an oasis city in Arabia called Tama, apparently pursuing personal religious interests in the moon god Sin, and who left his son Belshazzar as regent in Babylon during his extended absences. The Babylonian priesthood of Marduk, understandably irritated by a king who preferred a different god and who kept leaving, was not exactly loyal when the crisis came. The crisis came in 539 BCE, in the form of Cyrus, the Great of Persia. Cyrus was remarkable by any standard. He had already conquered the Median Empire and the wealthy Lydian kingdom, home of the legendarily rich King Croesus, before he turned his attention to Babylon. When he did, the campaign was remarkably swift. The Babylonian army was defeated in battle. Cyrus entered Babylon, and here's where the story gets interesting. Apparently without a fight, the city opened its gates. Nabonidus, who had finally come back from Tama, was captured but not killed. The Babylonian population, including the priesthood, seems to have welcomed Cyrus's arrival, at least according to Cyrus's own propaganda. He presented himself not as a conqueror but as a liberator, chosen by Marduk himself to restore the proper worship of the god that Nabonidus had neglected. The Cyrus cylinder, a baked clay cylinder inscribed with an account of the conquest in the name of Cyrus, describes the king's respect for Babylonian religious traditions and his policy of allowing deported peoples to return to their homelands and restore their temples. This includes, by implication, the Judean exiles, the return from Babylon that the Hebrew Bible presents as a second Exodus, a moment of divine rescue and restoration. Whether Cyrus was genuinely respectful of other cultures or was simply an extremely clever propagandist, or, most likely, some combination of both, his policy of religious tolerance and cultural inclusion was a significant departure from the Assyrian and Babylonian approach of population displacement and forced assimilation. The Persian Empire that he founded would go on to govern Mesopotamia, among many other regions, for 2 centuries, and it did so largely through a framework of local autonomy and cultural respect that was, by ancient standards, relatively enlightened. And with that, Mesopotamia passed from the hands of Mesopotamian rulers and into the Persian sphere, where it would remain until Alexander the Great arrived in 331 BCE with his own ideas about how things should be organized. But that is a story for another night. Tonight, let's spend some time on the quieter corners of Mesopotamian life that we haven't yet visited, the houses and streets and family lives and educational practices and medical beliefs and food and music and everything else that made up the actual texture of daily existence for the people who lived in this world. Because the kings and the empires get most of the attention, but most people weren't kings. Most people were just trying to live. We know a remarkable amount about what people ate in ancient Mesopotamia, because the administrative records that Mesopotamian scribes were so diligently producing include detailed accounts of rations, agricultural production, storage, and consumption. The picture that emerges is of a cuisine built on a fairly limited set of staple ingredients, but varied and sophisticated in its preparation. Barley, as I've mentioned, was the foundation of everything. Barley bread and barley porridge were daily staples. There were many different kinds of bread, leavened and unleavened, with different additives in different shapes. Bread could be baked in clay ovens or cooked directly on hot coals. It could be flavored with oil, honey, spices. It could be made into flat, thin sheets or thick, round loaves. Bread was not a single thing. It was a category, and within that category there was considerable variation. We actually have recipes, or at least something that functions as recipes, from ancient Mesopotamia. A collection of clay tablets from about 1700 BCE, now known as the Yale Culinary Tablets, contains what appear to be recipes for stews and broth-based dishes. They are the oldest known recipes in the world. They tend toward the terse. You cut the meat, you add leeks, you add onions, you add salt, you cook it, but they give us a genuine glimpse of what Babylonian cooking involved. The dishes include stews with various meats, lamb, kid, game birds, fish, flavored with onions, garlic, leeks, shallots, and various herbs. There were also fermented condiments, presumably adding sourness and depth. The overall impression is of a cuisine not wildly unlike some Middle Eastern food today, rich in aromatics built on slow-cooked meats and legumes, flavored with fermented and pickled ingredients. Fish was enormously important, especially in the south, where the rivers and the marshes provided abundant catches. Dried fish was a staple that could be stored and traded. Fish rations appear frequently in administrative records. River fish, sea fish, from the Persian Gulf, freshwater shellfish and various other aquatic creatures were all consumed. The marshlands of southern Mesopotamia, which still partially exist today, were extraordinarily productive ecosystems that supported not just fish, but also wildfowl, reeds for construction and writing, and a way of life that was distinct from the farming communities of the drear areas. Dates were the other great food staple of the South. The date palm grew abundantly in the Mesopotamian lowlands and produced fruit in quantities that could be stored, traded, and consumed in a remarkable variety of forms. Fresh dates, dried dates, date syrup, which served as a sweetener, date wine, date vinegar. Tatarau. The palm itself was useful in multiple other ways. Its fronds for roofing and basket weaving, its trunk for timber, not the finest timber, but in a region with limited tree cover, it mattered. The date palm appears so frequently in Mesopotamian iconography that it became something of a symbol of the region itself. The stylized sacred tree in royal reliefs is often interpreted as a date palm. Vegetables varied by season and region, but included onions, garlic, leeks, various legumes, lentils, chickpeas, beans, cucumbers, and leafy vegetables. Herbs and spices, coriander, cumin, thyme, and others were used in cooking. Oil, primarily sesame oil in the southern Mesopotamian tradition, was a staple for cooking and for use in other ways, as a fuel for lamps, as a cosmetic, as a ritual offering. Meat was eaten, but for ordinary people it was probably not an everyday food. Sheep and goat were the most common sources of meat. Pigs were raised in some periods and regions. Cattle were valuable primarily for their agricultural labor and their milk, and were not commonly slaughtered for food, except for special occasions. The wealthy ate more meat more often. The poor ate it rarely. This is true of most pre-modern societies and remains true in many parts of the world today. Dairy products, milk, butter, cheese, were produced and consumed, primarily from sheep, goats, and cattle. We have records of large-scale dairy operations attached to temples, producing significant quantities of butter and cheese for ritual use and for distribution as rations. And of course, there was beer. Always beer. Beer at breakfast, beer with meals, beer in the evening. Workers' beer rations were a significant component of the wage system. The quality of beer varied. There was good beer and ordinary beer, beer for the elite, and beer for everyone else. Medicinal preparations were sometimes dissolved in beer or administered with it. Beer was life, and life tasted of fermented barley. And honestly, there are worse ways to get through a day. Mesopotamians made extensive use of wool. The sheep herds of the temple economies produced vast quantities of it, and the textile workshops that processed that wool into fabric were major economic enterprises. We have records of hundreds of women employed in temple weaving workshops, producing textiles that were then used locally or exported as trade goods. The textile industry was, in many periods, the backbone of the export economy. Clothing styles varied by period and social class. In the earliest Sumerian periods, garments were often made of sheepskin or a tufted woolen fabric that gave a shaggy appearance. Over time, woven wool and later linen garments became more common. Basic garments tended toward wrapped and draped styles rather than tailored ones. Rectangular pieces of cloth arranged around the body in various configurations. Fringes were significant. The length and quality of the fringe on a garment indicated social status, and cutting someone's fringe was a legal gesture in certain contractual contexts. Jewelry was worn by both men and women of the upper classes, and by women more broadly. Gold, silver, carnelian, lapis lazuli, imported at considerable expense from what is now Afghanistan, and other semi-precious stones were used. The royal tombs at Ur, the famous death pits discovered by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, contained extraordinary jewelry, headdresses, musical instruments, and other goods, along with the remains of what appear to be attendants who were buried with the royal dead. This last element is deeply uncomfortable, obviously, and suggests that royal funerary practice in early summer included a dimension of human sacrifice that doesn't fit neatly into the general picture of Mesopotamian civilization. It appears to have been limited to the early periods and the highest elite levels, and it does not seem to have been a general practice, but it is there in the archaeological record, and it deserves acknowledgement. Health and medicine in ancient Mesopotamia existed in a space between the empirical and the supernatural, as it did in most ancient cultures. Physicians, the Asu, dealt with physical ailments through observation, herbal remedies, and practical interventions. Exorcists, the Ishipu, dealt with supernatural causes of illness through ritual, incantation, and the expulsion of evil demons or spirits. The two practitioners often worked alongside each other because illness was understood to potentially have both physical and spiritual dimensions, and you wanted both bases covered. The Mesopotamians compiled medical texts, lists of symptoms and their treatments, organized in systematic ways that suggest genuine clinical observation. A text might read, "If a patient has such and such symptoms, he has such and such condition, and you treat it with the following remedy." The remedies were a mixture of plant-based preparations, mineral substances, and animal products, some of which might have had real efficacy, some of which were probably useless, and some of which were creative. The combination of empirical observation and magical practice doesn't mean the empirical observation wasn't happening. It means it was happening within a worldview that also included magic, which is how most of human history worked until quite recently. Childbirth was presided over by a goddess, Ninhursag, or Nintu, and by the women who acted as midwives. Childbirth was genuinely dangerous, and the death of mothers and infants was common. Ritual prayers and incantations were used alongside physical assistance. The placenta and the umbilical cord had ritual significance. Names given to children were often prayers or declarations of faith. Marduk will protect, or the God is my helper. Expressions of the hope that divine assistance would attend the life of this new person who had arrived in a world that was not always kind. Children, once past the dangerous early years, were central to family life. Sons were important for the continuation of the family line, the inheritance of property, and in agricultural families, the continuation of farm labor. Daughters were given in marriage with dowries, property and goods that went with them and remained in some sense theirs rather than their husbands', and which could be recovered in cases of divorce or widowhood. The family unit was the site of education for young children, with formal scribal training reserved for a relatively small group of mostly male children from elite or literate families. Old age was respected, in theory. Elderly parents were supposed to be cared for by their children. This was a legal and moral obligation that appears in legal codes and in literary texts that celebrate the virtuous child who supports aging parents. Whether this obligation was always honored is a different question. We have texts in which elderly parents complain about neglect. We have contracts specifying exactly what children will provide for aged parents in exchange for inheritance rights. The gap between the ideal and the reality in ancient Mesopotamia was about the same size as it is everywhere else. Death was followed by burial, usually in or near the house in the earlier periods, in cemeteries in later periods. The dead were provided with food and goods because they continued to exist, in a diminished way, in the underworld, and they needed sustenance. Neglect of the dead could cause them to return and trouble the living. The ghosts of the neglected were a real concern, something to be addressed through proper ritual and regular offerings at the grave. The cult of the dead was not a grand religious institution. It was a family responsibility, a quiet, ongoing obligation to remember and maintain. The underworld in Mesopotamian conception, the Kur, or the land of no return, was not a pleasant place. It was not heaven, and it was not hell in any moralized sense. It was simply the land of the dead, dark, dusty, where the dead wore garments of feathers and ate clay. Even the great heroes went there eventually. Even the gods, if they ventured in, had to submit to its rules. It was the universal destination, and it was not one anyone looked forward to. The Gilgamesh epic, which we will get to shortly, is in large part a meditation on exactly this, on the reality of death, and the impossibility of escaping it, and what, if anything, remains when you accept that fact. But before we get to Gilgamesh, let me spend just a moment on something that I find particularly touching, which is the evidence of play and leisure in ancient Mesopotamia. Because people did not only work and worship and produce administrative records, they also played. The royal game of Ur, a board game discovered in the royal tombs at Ur by Leonard Woolley, is one of the oldest board games in the world, dating to approximately 2500 BCE. It has a distinctive board with a particular arrangement of squares, and it was played with dice and game pieces in a way that researchers have partially reconstructed, partly because a cuneiform tablet from the British Museum was discovered to contain playing instructions. Someone wrote down the rules on a clay tablet. For posterity, this person had priorities I respect. Children had toys, clay figurines, miniature animals, rattles. There are clay animal figures that appear to be children's toys rather than ritual objects. There are models of boats and wagons. There are small wheels on axles, miniature vehicles of some kind. There are tops. Children in ancient Mesopotamia were children, and they played, and they lost their toys under furniture, and adults probably stepped on them. Adults played music. Musicians were employed at temples and at royal courts, but music was also clearly part of ordinary life. The instruments of ancient Mesopotamia included harps, lyres, flutes, drums, and various others. The lyres found in the royal tombs at Ur are extraordinary objects, decorated with carved animal heads, inlaid with precious materials. They are beautiful, They were meant to produce something beautiful, sound organized into music, which is one of the oldest and most persistent human activities. We don't know exactly what Sumerian music sounded like, because notation in the modern sense didn't exist then. But we know they had it. We know it mattered. We know someone played those gorgeous lyres, and that someone else listened, and that there was, in the middle of all the administrative complexity and divine anxiety and royal ambition and agricultural labor of ancient Mesopotamia, music. Simply music. That is a nice thing to know. And now, finally, we come to Gilgamesh. If you were going to take one thing away from ancient Mesopotamia, one piece of cultural production that justifies all the attention we pay to this region and this civilization, it might be the Epic of Gilgamesh. It is the oldest known substantial literary narrative in human history. It is a story about friendship and loss and the terror of mortality and the search for meaning in the face of death. And it was written down more than 4,000 years ago, in a language that was already dead by the time of ancient Rome, on clay tablets that were buried under the desert and forgotten for 2 millennia until 19th century archaeologists dug them up and scholars spent decades piecing them together. The main version of the epic that we use today is sometimes called the Standard Babylonian Version, compiled and perhaps significantly revised by a scholar-poet named Sinlekionni, probably in the Middle Babylonian period, roughly 1300 to 1000 BCE. But the stories it tells are older. There are earlier Sumerian poems about Gilgamesh, separate compositions that were later incorporated and transformed into the unified epic. The character of Gilgamesh himself may be based on a real king of Uruk from around 2700 BCE, though the historical figure has been so thoroughly mythologized that extracting any real history from the legend is essentially impossible. The epic opens with a description of Gilgamesh himself, king of Uruk, 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a ratio that raises mathematical questions I will not pursue here. He is described as the greatest of kings, a builder of walls, a man of surpassing beauty and strength. He is also at the start of the story kind of terrible. He oppresses his city. He takes the young men for his own purposes and won't let them rest. He claims his right to spend the first night with new brides, the US Primae Noctis, first night rites, which in this text at least seems to be presented as a genuine grievance rather than a literary device. The people of Uruk cry out to the gods for relief. The gods' solution is to create a companion for Gilgamesh, someone who will match him in strength and energy, and give him someone appropriate to wrestle with instead of oppressing his city. They create Enkidu, a wild man who lives with the animals, who eats grass, who has never known human civilization. He is hairy and powerful and innocent in the way that someone who has never dealt with other people can be innocent. A hunter encounters him at a watering hole and is alarmed. The solution to the problem of Enkidu, apparently, is to send a woman, a temple prostitute named Shamhat, to civilize him. Shamhat and Enkidu spend a week together, and after that Enkidu can no longer run with the animals. They flee from him now. He has crossed over into the human world and cannot go back. He has lost something, innocence perhaps, or simply animal belonging, and gained something in return, language, companionship, a sense of purpose. This ambivalence about civilization and what it costs, what we give up when we enter the social world, runs through the Gilgamesh epic in ways that resonate even now. Enkidu goes to Uruk. He and Gilgamesh fight, an epic wrestling match in the middle of the city, and from this violent encounter, they become the closest of friends. This is a very particular kind of ancient narrative logic. The person you fight hardest is the person who matches you, and the person who matches you is your truest companion. The wrestling match establishes equality. The friendship that follows is one of the great relationships in ancient literature. Together, Gilgamesh and Enkidu have adventures. They travel to the cedar forest, perhaps in what is now Lebanon or Syria, to fight and kill its guardian, the monstrous Humbaba. Gilgamesh wants to do this partly for glory, partly to make a name for himself that will outlast his death. He says explicitly, "Even if I die in the forest, I will have made a name for myself. Future generations will say, Gilgamesh died fighting Humbaba." This is comforting to him. Legacy as a response to mortality. We recognize this. The killing of Humbaba is not in the text entirely glorious. Humbaba pleads for his life. Gilgamesh wavers. Enkidu urges him to finish it. They kill the guardian and cut down the cedar trees. There's something troubling in the scene that the text doesn't fully resolve. The conquered monster who begs is a more complicated figure than a pure villain. Ancient literature, even very ancient literature, is sometimes more nuanced than we expect. After the cedar forest, Gilgamesh and Enkidu return to Uruk, where something unexpected happens. The goddess Ishtar, Inanna in her Akkadian form, proposes to Gilgamesh. She is attracted to him. She desires him as her lover. This seems like a significant honor. Gilgamesh's response is one of the most remarkable speeches in ancient literature. He says no. And his reason for saying no is that he has looked at Ishtar's track record. He catalogs her previous lovers. Each one, he points out, came to a bad end. One was turned into a wolf. One became a spider. One was turned into a bird. Gilgamesh essentially tells a goddess that he has studied her romantic history and he has concerns. This is either very brave or very foolish. And as with most things that are both very brave and very foolish, it does not end well for him. Ishtar is furious. She goes to the gods and demands revenge, and the revenge comes in the form of the Bull of Heaven, a divine creature sent to destroy Uruk. Gilgamesh and Enkidu kill it. Enkidu adds insult to injury by throwing part of the dead bull at Ishtar. It is not a subtle moment. The gods convene. Someone has to be punished for all this. The killing of Humbaba, the killing of the Bull of Heaven, the general chaos. Enkidu is the one who is chosen to die, and he dies slowly, of an illness sent by the gods, over 12 days. Gilgamesh watches his friend deteriorate and cannot save him. When Enkidu finally dies, Gilgamesh's grief is total. And here is where the epic shifts and becomes something else. Up to this point, it has been an adventure story. Heroes going on quests, killing monsters, acquiring glory. Now it becomes something much quieter and much more painful. Gilgamesh sits with the body of his friend and cannot accept it. He mourns for 7 days, refusing to let the body be buried, looking at Enkidu's face and waiting for him to open his eyes. He only allows burial when a maggot falls from Enkidu's nostril, the sight of physical decay finally forcing the reality of death through his denial. And then Gilgamesh, who has killed monsters and insulted goddesses and been called the greatest of kings, is afraid. He is afraid of death. He has seen it now in the face of someone he loved, and he cannot unfeel it. He sets out on a journey, not for glory this time, but for a different reason entirely. He is going to find Utnapishtim, the one man who survived the great flood, and was granted immortality by the gods. Gilgamesh is going to find the secret of eternal light. The journey takes him through dark tunnels at the edge of the world, past the scorpion beings who guard the passage of the sun, across the waters of death, to the island where Utnapishtim lives beyond the reach of ordinary mortality. And Utnapishtim tells him the story of the flood. The full, detailed account that parallels the later biblical story of Noah with remarkable closeness. The gods deciding to flood the earth. Enki warning, Atnapishtim datal. The building of the boat. The animals taken aboard. The flood subsiding. The dove, the swallow, the raven sent out to test whether the waters had receded. The offering made on the mountain when the boat came to rest. The gods, smelling the smoke of the sacrifice, gathered around like flies because they had been hungry during the flood. And then Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh something he does not want to hear. The gods held a council after the flood and decided, specifically and deliberately, that Utnapishtim's immortality would be a unique exception. It will not happen again. There is no secret knowledge that Gilgamesh can acquire to live forever. Death is the lot of human beings, decreed from the beginning. But Utnapishtim, perhaps out of compassion, tells Gilgamesh about a plant at the bottom of the sea. Not immortality, exactly, but a plant that can restore youth. Gilgamesh dives for it, retrieves it, carries it away. He tells himself he will bring it back to Uruk and share it with the elders of his city. He has begun to think about others, which is a change from the beginning of the story. He sets off for home, and then he stops beside a pool to wash, and a snake smells the plant and steals it while he sleeps. The snake sheds its skin, renewing itself, and disappears. And Gilgamesh sits beside the pool and weeps. He has come all this way. He has endured the journey through the dark tunnels, crossed the waters of death, spoken to the only immortal human being, retrieved the plant of youth from the bottom of the sea, and a snake took it. He goes home to Uruk. The epic ends with him showing the walls of his city to his ferryman, describing them, their dimensions, their beauty, the way they enclose the city, and the orchards, and the temple. The walls he built, the city he made. This is what remains. Not immortality, not eternal youth. The walls. It is one of the great endings in literature, and it is 4,000 years old. The message of the Gilgamesh epic is not hopeful in the conventional sense. It does not tell you that everything will be okay, or that death can be conquered, or that your grief will pass entirely. It tells you that death is real and final, and that the things you love will be taken from you. And it also tells you that in the face of this, people have built cities and written poems and made friendships that changed them. That the walls of Uruk are still standing at the end of the story, and that is not nothing. This is a story written by people who lived in mud-brick houses in a hot, flat plain between two unpredictable rivers 4,000 years ago. They knew about loss. They knew about fear. They wrote it down in clay, and the clay survived. And here we are, reading it in the dark, late at night. There is something in that which I find genuinely comforting. We have been afraid of death, and we have loved people, and we have made things and told stories about all of it for a very, very long time. The specific forms change. The shape of the grief does not. Let's rest here for a moment in the shadow of those walls. And then, let's continue. We've talked about writing briefly. Let's talk about learning to write. Because in a civilization where written records were fundamental to economic and administrative life, the production of scribes was not incidental. It was essential. And the institution that produced scribes, the Ajaba or tablet house, is one of the most human and recognizable institutions in the ancient world, once you spend a little time with the texts it left behind. The Ajaba in the Sumerian period was a school, primarily for boys, sons of administrators, merchants, priests, officials, who were being trained for careers in the scribal profession. The training was long, demanding, and not notably kind. Students learned to write cuneiform by copying first simple lists, then more complex texts, then literary works. The curriculum has been partially reconstructed from the tablet students left behind, and it included sign lists, word lists organized by category, professions, animals, plants, objects, mathematical exercises, and eventually literary compositions including hymns, proverbs, and eventually the major literary texts of the tradition. The proverbs are particularly wonderful because they give us a glimpse of the wisdom tradition that surrounded this educational world. Sumerian proverbs were compiled in long lists and were apparently used as educational texts. Students copied them as part of their training. Some of them are deeply practical. A man who is honest in his business dealings will prosper. Some of them are gnomic in a way that might mean several things. The dog who goes to the market will bite. Some of them are darkly funny. You can have a lord, you can have a king, but the man to fear is the tax collector. This last one was written 4,000 years ago and has lost precisely zero of its relevance. There's a Sumerian text, sometimes called School Days in translation, that describes a student's day at the Ajubba in the kind of vivid, slightly miserable detail that suggests either autobiographical origin or extremely good observation. The student wakes up, goes to school, is criticized by the teacher for being late, sits down to practice, is criticized for his handwriting, stands up to recite, is criticized for that, eats his lunch, is criticized for something about his lunch, gets beaten for multiple infractions during the day, goes home exhausted, and complains to his father. The father's solution is to invite the teacher to dinner, feed him very well, dress him in new clothes, and give him extra payment. The teacher then praises the son effusively and predicts a brilliant future for him. The text is clearly meant to be somewhat comic. The contrast between the brutal reality of school and the instant improvement when the teacher is well-fed and well-paid is played for gentle irony. But it also tells us real things about how educational relationships worked, about the role of parental intervention, about the way economic incentives shaped even ancient educational institutions. The teacher who was treated well gave better reviews. Some things are not particular to any century. Mathematical education in the Ajubba was genuinely sophisticated. Mesopotamian mathematics was remarkable for its time, using a base 60 system, sexagesimal, that we still use today for measuring time and angles. 60 minutes in an hour, 60 seconds in a minute, 360 degrees in a circle. These come directly from Mesopotamian mathematical tradition, inherited through the Greeks and into modern usage. Mesopotamian scribes calculated areas of fields, volumes of granaries, the yields of crops, given specific area and seed input. They solved quadratic equations, a concept usually associated with much later mathematical development. They compiled tables of reciprocals, squares, square roots, and cube roots. There are mathematical problem tablets that read like textbooks, posing a problem, working through it step by step, arriving at the answer. The problems are often practical. If a field is this shape, what is its area? If a canal needs to be dug to these specifications, how much labor is required? But there are also problems that seem to have no immediate practical application, abstract mathematical puzzles that suggest people working through mathematical relationships for the pleasure of the intellectual exercise. Mesopotamian scribes were not just accountants. Some of them were mathematicians in the genuine sense of people who find the internal logic of numbers interesting in itself. Astronomy was another area of advanced Mesopotamian intellectual achievement, connected to both the practical need for a reliable calendar and the religious importance of celestial omens. Over centuries of careful observation and record-keeping, Babylonian astronomers developed the ability to predict astronomical events with impressive accuracy. Eclipses, the movements of the planets, the heliacal rising of Venus. They developed mathematical models of planetary motion. They identified the constellations of the zodiac, which the Greeks later adopted and which modern astrology still uses. The transmission of Babylonian astronomical knowledge to the Greek world through Hellenistic contacts is one of the channels through which ancient Mesopotamian intellectual achievement shaped the Western tradition. Back in the classroom, students also learned languages. During the period when Akkadian had largely replaced Sumerian as the spoken language of Mesopotamia, Sumerian remained the prestige language of literature and scholarship, somewhat as Latin functioned in medieval Europe. Scribes needed to know both. There were bilingual word lists, bilingual dictionaries, Sumerian texts with Akkadian translations. The preservation of Sumerian as a scholarly and literary language long after it ceased to be anyone's mother tongue meant that the great literary texts of Sumerian tradition, the hymns of Enheduanna, the laments for destroyed cities, the stories of the gods, survived and were read and copied by Akkadian-speaking scribes centuries after Sumerian was spoken only by the learned. Literature was not just read and studied, it was composed. The scribal tradition was not purely reproductive. Scribes wrote new texts, adapted old ones, created new hymns for new occasions, responded to the events of their time in literary form. We have laments written for specific historical disasters, city destructions, military defeats. We have hymns written for specific kings, praising them in language that draws on established conventions, but applies them to current circumstances. The boundary between scribe and author was permeable. The tradition was living, not merely archival. And education was not only for boys. There is evidence, across different periods, of literate women in Mesopotamia, women who could read and write, who worked as scribes in certain temple contexts, who used literary and scribal skills in their professional life. The Nadetu women I mentioned earlier, attached to temples, were often literate and used their skills in managing their economic activities. Some women worked as professional scribes. The evidence is not abundant, but it exists, and it complicates any simple picture of literacy as an exclusively male domain. The world of the Ajaba was, in the end, a world within a world, a specialized community of learning, with its own culture and humor and hierarchies and anxieties, operating within the larger world of the Mesopotamian city. It produced the people who made everything else work: the administrators, the priests, the merchants, the astronomers, the poets. It passed knowledge from generation to generation, adapted it, added to it, preserved it in clay when the world outside was changing. And then, eventually, the clay tablets went into the ground. The cities fell and were covered by wind-blown dust, and the languages of Mesopotamia died, and the writing systems were forgotten, and no one alive could read them anymore, for more than 2,000 years. Until, in the 19th century CE, scholars with chisels and brushes began to dig them up, and began, with extraordinary patience and effort, to decipher them, to reconstruct the grammar of dead languages, to read the scribal exercises and the administrative records and the myths, and the love poetry and the complaints about bad copper, to bring all of it back. There is something remarkable about that reversal. The scribes of ancient Mesopotamia wrote in clay because clay is durable. Fire destroys papyrus, floods rot wood, but fired clay survives almost indefinitely. They could not have known that their records would be buried for millennia. They were not writing for posterity in any grand sense. They were writing because there were accounts to keep and hymns to record and legal decisions to document. They were doing their jobs. And their jobs, done in clay, lasted longer than the empires that commissioned them, longer than the cities that housed them, longer, by a very long margin, than anyone involved could possibly have imagined. The words are still there. We can still read them. Nani is still furious about the copper. Enheduanna is still praising, In Anna, the student is still getting beaten for his handwriting. The proverb about the tax collector is still true. The Epic of Gilgamesh still ends with a man standing beside the walls of a city, trying to find meaning in what he has built, in the face of everything he has lost. We can still read all of it, and reading it, we find not alien, distant, incomprehensible beings, but people who were afraid and hopeful and creative and persistent and funny and grieving and ambitious and tired. People who kept going, not unlike us. Let's take some time to talk properly about women in ancient Mesopotamia, because it is easy when talking about ancient history to fall into a flattened picture. Women were oppressed. Women had no rights. Women were invisible. And while that picture has some truth to it at some times, and in some places, Mesopotamia is a case where the reality is considerably more textured. Women in ancient Mesopotamia occupied a complicated position, one that varied significantly by period, by social class, by urban versus rural context, and by the specific roles they occupied. They were not equals by any modern standard. But they were not simply property either. The legal and literary record is full of women who acted, who owned things, who made decisions, who were heard. Let's start with property. In the Old Babylonian period, the era of Hammurabi and the centuries around it, women could own property, inherit it, manage it, sell it, and pass it on. The dowry a woman brought to her marriage was hers. It followed her if she divorced. It could be passed to her children. It was not simply absorbed by her husband's household. This is not nothing. In many later societies, women's property was routinely absorbed by marriage. In Mesopotamia, the legal distinction was maintained, at least in principle. Women could appear in court, give testimony, serve as witnesses to contracts. Legal documents list women as parties to transactions, buying, selling, lending, borrowing, ... The two women I've mentioned were particularly active economically, but ordinary women from merchant and craftsman families also appear in the archives conducting business. A woman might manage household finances while her husband was away on a trading journey. A widow might take over management of the family business. A woman might lend money at interest. The Tankrum, the Mesopotamian merchant, was typically male. The long-distance trade that took men to distant cities was primarily a male domain. But women participated in local trade, in textile production and sale, in tavern keeping. Female tavern keepers, the Esibitu or alewife, were a recognized professional class. The most famous alewife in Mesopotamian literature is Siduri, who appears in the Gilgamesh epic. She lives at the edge of the sea. She makes wine, and when Gilgamesh arrives at her door looking terrible and grief-stricken from his long journey, she gives him advice. Siduri's advice is worth quoting in spirit, even if we can't quote it directly. She tells Gilgamesh essentially to stop looking for immortality. To eat, drink, bathe, be clean, look at the child who holds your hand. Let your wife delight in your embrace. These are the things that matter, the things that are possible. Live the life you have. It is the Epicurean argument made by a tavern keeper at the edge of the world, and it is the philosophical alternative the epic presents to Gilgamesh's quest, a path he doesn't take, but one the text presents with genuine sympathy. Marriage in ancient Mesopotamia was, as I've mentioned, a legal contract. But within that contract, the relationship between husband and wife was not simply one of ownership. There is personal correspondence between married couples that shows genuine affection and mutual concern. A husband writes to his wife, "I am well, do not worry." A wife writes to her absent husband, "When are you coming home? Things are difficult here. I need you." There is the ordinary texture of a life shared, the practical concerns, the emotional notes, the small reassurances. There is also in some periods evidence of women exercising religious authority. The priestesses I mentioned, appointed to serve as the symbolic wives of patron gods, held positions of genuine power. Enheduanna was the most famous, but she was not the only one. The office continued for centuries, passing from one royal daughter to the next, maintaining its significance in the religious and political landscape. There were also female diviners and exorcists, though they are less well attested than their male counterparts. There were female musicians employed by temples. There were women who served in the most senior positions of temple administration. The sacred world was not entirely male, even if it was predominantly so. Lower down the social scale, women's lives were shaped primarily by household and agricultural labor. In farming families, women worked in the fields alongside men during peak labor periods. They processed grain, grinding, sifting, baking. They wove textiles, a time-consuming, skilled, and economically significant activity. They managed the household's food supplies, preserved food for the dry season, traded surplus goods in local markets. They raised children and cared for the elderly. Their labor was essential to the household economy, even when it was not formally recognized in the administrative records that historians rely on. There is a poetic text, sometimes called a diatribe or debate text, in which summer and winter argue about which is more valuable. In the course of the argument, each describes the work of women during its season, the weaving done in winter by lamplight, the field work of summer, the processing of the harvest. It's a genre text, not a personal document, but it incidentally preserves a picture of the gendered labor calendar of agricultural Mesopotamia that is quite vivid. The lives of enslaved women in Mesopotamia were, obviously, much more constrained. Slavery in the ancient world was not racial. It was typically the result of debt, conquest, or birth to enslaved parents. Enslaved people could be owned by temples, by palaces, or by private individuals. Their legal status was property, but they had some legal protections. Owners could not simply kill them without consequences, and there were mechanisms for manumission, granting of freedom. Enslaved women in domestic service occupied a complex position, subject to the authority of the household they served, but also integrated into its daily life in ways that created complicated social relationships. Women of the royal household occupied yet another distinct position. The wives and mothers of kings could exercise significant influence, advising on political decisions, corresponding with foreign rulers, managing substantial households and their own estates. The queens of the Neo-Assyrian period, for example, are attested in administrative records managing large amounts of property and presiding over court women. The queen mother, the mother of the current king, was often a figure of particular influence in Mesopotamian courts, as she was in many monarchical systems. And then there were the women who appear in the literary tradition as purely symbolic figures. The great mother goddess, the mourning wife, the treacherous temptress. These are archetypes that tell us about how male authors conceptualized femininity rather than about the actual lives of women. But they exist alongside the administrative and legal records that show us real women doing real things. And the contrast between the two kinds of evidence is itself interesting. The symbolic women of Mesopotamian literature are far less interesting than the actual women of the archives. The actual women are messy and specific, and doing things that archetypes don't do, like lending money at interest and complaining to their husbands about the management of the household and writing hymns to powerful goddesses. The actual women are, in other words, people, complex, variable, shaped by their circumstances, but not entirely defined by them, navigating a world that was structured against their full participation in many ways, and finding within those constraints the spaces they could inhabit and expand and use. This has also, one notes, been a recurring human project. It continues. Let's talk about death. Calmly, gently. It's late, and we're already in the contemplative mood. The Mesopotamian afterlife was not, to put it plainly, a selling point. I mentioned the underworld briefly earlier. The Kur, the land of no return, the dark place where the dead wear feathers and eat clay. Let me spend a little more time with it now, because the Mesopotamian conception of what happens after death is philosophically interesting, even if it is not particularly comforting. In most periods of Mesopotamian thought, there was no heaven in the later sense, no realm of bliss for the virtuous dead, no paradise as reward for righteous living. The underworld was simply the destination of all the dead, regardless of how they had lived. The good and the bad, the king and the slave, the pious and the impious, all of them went to the same place. The quality of existence in the underworld was influenced not by morality, but by practical considerations. How well your survivors cared for your spirit by providing offerings, and to some extent how you had died and what burial you had received. A proper burial was important. Without it, the spirit of the dead person could not rest. It might wander and trouble the living. The unburied dead were a category of particular concern. Soldiers left on a battlefield, people drowned in rivers, those who had no family to bury them. Their ghosts might return, hungry and restless, seeking the attention they had been denied in death. The rituals of mourning and burial were not just emotionally necessary. They were cosmic ones. They settled the dead in their proper place and allowed the living to return to ordinary life. The offerings that families made to the spirits of the dead, food, drink, oil, were believed to actually sustain those spirits in the underworld. This gave ordinary people a continued relationship with their dead relatives that was simultaneously comforting. The dead are still there. We can still do things for them. And burdensome. We have to keep doing things for them indefinitely, or they suffer. The cult of the dead was, in this sense, an extension of family obligation beyond the grave. The Sumerian and Babylonian texts give us some images of the underworld's physical conditions. It was described as a place of dust, of darkness, of silence. The city of the dead, sometimes with its own gate and its own queen, Ereshkigal, sister of Inanna, a figure of formidable and somewhat frightening power. The divine inhabitants of the underworld were the Anunnaki, gods who had been assigned there, divine beings whose power was real, but exercised in the realm of death rather than life. Heroes who had died extraordinary deaths were sometimes described as existing in the underworld in positions of special authority. Gilgamesh himself, in later texts, is described as a judge in the underworld, one of those who decides the fates of the dead. This is a slight mitigation. If you were the greatest hero who ever lived, maybe you get a job in the afterlife. Everyone else just exists there. Vaguely. The fear of death in Mesopotamian literature is not fear of hell in the later sense, not fear of punishment, not fear of divine judgment for one's sins. It is something more existential than that. It is the fear of cessation, of no longer being in the sunlight, no longer eating good food, no longer embracing the people you love. The underworld texts dwell on sensory deprivation, the absence of light, of taste, of warmth. What you lose in death is the quality of experience that makes life worth having. That is the loss, and it is a real and irreversible one. This is why Gilgamesh's quest is so deeply felt. He is not trying to avoid hell. He is trying to keep being Gilgamesh, the man who walks in sunlight, who has a city, who has companions. And the epic tells him, gently, through the words of Siduri and Utnapishtim, that this is not possible. The gods decreed death for human beings and kept life for themselves. The best available response is to live fully while you are alive, to make things, to love people, to build walls that will outlast you. This is not a consoling theology exactly. It is an honest one, and there is a particular kind of courage in it, the Mesopotamian acceptance that the universe is not organized around human preferences, combined with the determination to live meaningfully within those constraints anyway. The Mesopotamians had by the late period developed some more elaborate ideas about the afterlife, about the possibility of better conditions for the dead under certain circumstances, about the role of good deeds and proper piety in shaping one's fate. But these remain relatively undeveloped compared to later religious traditions. The dominant note, sustained across centuries of literature, is the one we've been discussing. Death is real. It is final. It comes for everyone. And the best response is to do something good with the time you have. Gilgamesh was told this 4,000 years ago and went on a quest anyway, which is extremely human. Eventually he came home and described the walls. We are still, in our various ways, going on quests, and sometimes coming home and looking at what we've built. Ancient Mesopotamia was not self-sufficient. This is a crucial fact about the region that shaped almost everything about its economic and political history. The fertile river plain between the Tigris and Euphrates could grow food in abundance, and it could produce textiles in large quantities, but it had almost no timber worth mentioning, very little usable stone, and essentially no metal ores. For all of these essential materials, the wood for construction and ships, the stone for monuments and tools, the copper and tin for bronze, the silver for currency, the gold for decoration, Mesopotamia had to trade. This dependence on external resources is one of the reasons the Mesopotamian merchant, the Tamkurum, was such a central figure in the economic life of the region. Trade was not an optional supplement to the Mesopotamian economy. It was structurally necessary. Someone had to go and get the things that couldn't be produced locally, and someone had to figure out how to pay for them with what could be produced locally. This someone was, in many periods, organized under the authority of the temple or the palace, which provided capital, direction, and protection. In other periods, private merchants operated on their own accounts, though often with official involvement or oversight. We have extraordinary documentation of one particular trading network, the old Assyrian trade colony system of the early 2nd millennium BCE, roughly 2000 to 1750 BCE. Merchants from the city of Ashur established trading colonies. Karum, the plural, is Kiara, in cities of central Anatolia, modern Turkey, with the most important at a place called Kanesh, modern Kiltepe. These colonies were not military conquests. They were commercial establishments, neighborhoods where Assyrian merchants lived, stored goods, conducted business, and maintained their own legal institutions. The trade these merchants conducted was primarily in tin, imported to Ashur from the east and transshipped westward, and textiles produced in Ashur and surrounding areas. They traded these into Anatolia for silver and gold, which they then shipped back to Ashur. The logistics of this operation were considerable. Overland journeys of hundreds of miles, by donkey caravan, over mountain passes in all seasons. The tablets left behind by these merchants, discovered at Kultepe in thousands of examples, give us an intimate view of how ancient long-distance trade actually worked. There are business letters, a merchant in Ashur writing to his agent in Kanesh, telling him to sell if the price is right and hold if it isn't. There are shipping manifests. There are legal contracts and promissory notes and records of disputes. There are personal letters, a merchant writing to his wife, who managed affairs in Ashur while he was away, asking about the family, giving instructions, receiving news. There are letters from wives to husbands that are a beautiful combination of the personal and the commercial. I love you, please come home. Also, the price of tin has gone up. Also, your brother is being difficult about the estate. The lives of these merchants were shaped by prolonged absence. Long-distance trade required months, sometimes years, of travel. Merchants had families in Ashur and sometimes also in Kanesh. The question of whether the relationships formed in the Anatolian colonies counted as second marriages, with the legal and economic implications that carried, is one of the fascinating tangles that appears in the legal records. The status of children born to merchants and local women in Kanesh, the obligations of merchants to families left behind, the way that commerce and intimacy became entangled across distance. One letter in particular has become famous among scholars of this period. It's from a woman named Lamasa to her husband, the merchant P. Shu Han Han, and it is simultaneously a business communication and an expression of personal feeling. She tells him she is managing the business as best she can. She describes her financial difficulties, and then she adds, "And this is the part that stays with you, that she is sitting in the dark. She can't afford oil for her lamps." She sends this letter to her husband, who is hundreds of miles away, possibly over mountains, and asks him to come home or send money. The business news and the personal loneliness are completely intertwined, because that's how life actually is. The practical and the emotional don't separate into neat compartments. P. Shukan, by the way, did continue to operate in Anatolia for some years. Whether he sent the oil, the record doesn't tell us. The goods that moved through the ancient Near East created connections between regions that could be genuinely surprising in their reach. Lapis lazuli, the brilliant blue stone used in Mesopotamian jewelry and artistic objects, came from a single source: mines in what is now northeastern Afghanistan, in the region around Badakhshan. From there, it traveled across thousands of miles of Central Asia, through Iran into Mesopotamia, and sometimes further to Egypt and the Aegean. A piece of lapis lazuli in a Sumerian necklace represents an astonishing chain of exchange networks, each link passing the stone on to the next. No single merchant probably knowing the full extent of the chain. This is one of the things ancient trade routes remind us. The ancient world was not as isolated and disconnected as we sometimes imagine. People were moving across large distances. Goods were traveling even further. Ideas and technologies and artistic styles were being transmitted along with the physical objects. The Bronze Age, at its height, was a period of genuine international connectivity, a world in which rulers of Egypt, the Levant, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia wrote to each other regularly. The Amarna letters, discovered in Egypt, give us a vivid picture of this diplomatic correspondence. Traded luxury goods, married each other's daughters, and acknowledged each other as members of a The collapse of this system, the Bronze Age collapse of around 1200 BCE, was one of the most dramatic and still not fully explained discontinuities in ancient history. Multiple civilizations fell within a few decades. The trading networks were disrupted. The palace economies collapsed. Cities were destroyed and not rebuilt. Writing systems were lost. It was, on the available evidence, a genuinely catastrophic period, and its causes are still debated. Climate change, internal rebellions, external migrations, the disruption of trade routes, probably some combination of all of these. Mesopotamia was not as severely affected by the Bronze Age collapse as some other regions. The palace economies there had been replaced earlier by more decentralized structures, which may have made them more resilient. But the collapse reshaped the world around Mesopotamia in ways that affected the region for centuries. New peoples came: the Aryans, who would eventually become the dominant population in much of Syria and northern Mesopotamia, and whose language, Aramaic, would become the lingua franca of the ancient Near East. New powers rose. New configurations of trade and politics emerged. And through all of it, the merchants kept going. The donkey caravans might change their routes, the trading partners might change, the goods in demand might shift, but the fundamental activity continued. Someone always needed to go somewhere else and bring back something that couldn't be produced at home. And someone always needed to write to their spouse to explain why they weren't home yet, and to ask about the children, and to include some instruction about the price of tin. The Persian conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE did not, as I mentioned, end Mesopotamian civilization. It changed who was in charge, and it changed some of the political and administrative frameworks. But the cities continued to function. The temples continued to operate. The scribes continued to write. Babylonian astronomy and mathematics continued to develop and would reach some of its highest achievements in the Achaemenid Persian and Seleucid Greek periods. Under Persian rule, Babylon remained an important city, one of several royal capitals, visited by Persian kings, the site of royal building projects and continued religious observance. The Temple of Marduk continued to function. The New Year festival continued to be celebrated. Babylonian scholars continued their astronomical observations and their mathematical work. Alexander the Great arrived in 331 BCE and defeated the Persian forces at the Battle of Gaugamela, after which Babylon surrendered without resistance. Alexander was apparently genuinely impressed by Babylon. He treated it with respect, restored the Temple of Marduk, which had been damaged during Xerxes' somewhat less tolerant reign, and made plans to make Babylon one of the capitals of his new empire. He died there in 323 BCE, at the age of 32, of causes that have been debated ever since, probably some combination of disease, heavy drinking, and the accumulated physical damage of years of extreme military campaigning. After Alexander's death, his empire was divided among his generals. Mesopotamia eventually fell to the Seleucid dynasty, Greek rulers who governed from Syria. The Seleucids founded new cities, promoted Greek culture, and presided over a period of genuine cultural mixing. The encounter between Mesopotamian and Greek intellectual traditions produced remarkable results, particularly in astronomy and mathematics. Babylonian astronomical knowledge flowed into the Greek world through this contact, and some of the most sophisticated Babylonian astronomical tables, predicting planetary positions with mathematical precision, date to the Seleucid period. Cuneiform continued to be used by a decreasing number of specialists, temple scholars who maintained the old traditions of astronomical observation, omen reading, and religious ritual. The language became progressively less understood outside these specialist circles. The last dated cuneiform tablet comes from 75 CE, more than 6 centuries after the Persian conquest, more than 4 centuries after Alexander. Someone, somewhere, was still using the old writing system, writing in the old language, performing the old rituals, in the early years of what we call the Common Era. And then, finally, they stopped. The knowledge was lost. The clay tablets went into the ground. The cities of ancient Mesopotamia became tells, mounds of accumulated occupation, layer on layer of mud brick construction, each generation building on the debris of the previous one. The landscape became dotted with these mounds, their origins mysterious, their contents unknown. Local communities sometimes built on them, knowing only that they were old, that they had always been there, that things could be found in them after rains, fragments of pottery, sometimes stranger things. And then, in the 19th century, the archaeological and scholarly effort to recover ancient Mesopotamia began. The decipherment of cuneiform, a parallel effort to the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphics that was happening in the same era, took decades and involved multiple scholars working independently and in collaboration, making incremental advances, arguing with each other, testing their conclusions against new finds. The breakthrough came in stages, with the cuneiform script of Old Persian, which could be compared to known Greek translations of Persian royal inscriptions, providing a key that eventually allowed scholars to work their way to Akkadian and then to Sumerian. The first confirmed decipherment of cuneiform is generally dated to the 1850s, though the work of consolidation and expansion continued for decades. And what the decipherment revealed, the depth and richness of the Mesopotamian literary and intellectual tradition, was astonishing to the scholars who uncovered it. The discovery in 1872 of the flood tablet from the Gilgamesh epic by a scholar named George Smith, working at the British Museum, caused a sensation. Here was a flood story clearly related to the biblical account of Noah, written on a clay tablet more than 1,000 years before the biblical text was composed. Smith was so excited when he realized what he was reading that, by his own account, he began taking off his clothes. In the reading room of the British Museum, his colleagues were presumably somewhat startled. The excavations at Nineveh, Nimrud, Nippur, Ur, Lagash, Uruk, and many other sites through the 19th and 20th centuries brought up hundreds of thousands of tablets and an astonishing array of material culture. The sculpture, the jewelry, the architecture, the tools and vessels and toys and gaming boards of a civilization that had been buried for 2 millennia. Much of this material ended up in museums in Europe and North America, which has been and continues to be a source of legitimate controversy about the ethics of colonial-era archaeology and the question of where the cultural heritage of ancient Mesopotamia properly belongs. The material that was recovered, whatever the complicated history of its acquisition, has transformed our understanding of human history. It has pushed back the origins of writing, of cities, of mathematics, of literature. It has shown us the roots of ideas and institutions and stories that we had thought were much younger. It has introduced us to people we had forgotten. Enheduanna, who wrote hymns 4,000 years ago. Nanny, who was furious about copper. The unnamed woman who couldn't afford oil for her lamps. The student who got beaten for his handwriting. These people are available to us now. Their words are readable. Their lives are partially recoverable. They are not so different from us, and they were here a very long time ago, doing the difficult business of being human in a world that required it. There is, in the recovery of ancient Mesopotamia, something that feels like a correction of an injustice, not the injustice of colonial archaeology, which is real and ongoing, but the quieter injustice of forgetting. These people built civilizations. They wrote literature. They developed mathematics and astronomy and law and religious philosophy. They worried about their children and their finances and their health. They told stories to help them understand a universe that was often frightening and frequently incomprehensible. They made beautiful things in clay and in stone and in language. And then they were forgotten. For 2,000 years, they were simply gone. The languages unreadable. The cities buried, the names lost, and now they are found again, slowly and imperfectly, in fragments and approximations, but genuinely found. We can reach across 4,000 years and read Enheduanna's words, and they are moving. We can read the Gilgamesh epic, and it says something true about grief and mortality and friendship that nothing has made obsolete. We can read Nanny's complaint tablet and feel the entirely human frustration of a man who has been cheated and is not going to let it go. The past is strange and the past is familiar, often at the same time, and the people who lived in it were strangers to us. In many ways, and in other ways, we're not strangers at all. We have been traveling for a long time tonight, through the flat, hot plain between the rivers. Through the mud brick houses and the great temple complexes, through the administrative records and the legal codes and the great myths, through the schools and the markets and the trading caravans, through the lives of kings and the lives of ordinary people, and through the long, quiet aftermath of a civilization that eventually went into the ground and had to be dug up again. It is, I hope, a journey that has been gentle enough for a late night. We have not encountered anything truly terrible tonight, just the ordinary human mix of difficulty and determination, of fear and creativity, of imperfect institutions and remarkable achievements. The Mesopotamians were not saints. They kept slaves, they conquered their neighbors, they deported populations, they performed rituals that seemed strange or troubling from a modern perspective. They were people of their time, shaped by the assumptions and structures of a world very different from ours. But they were also people who invented writing because they needed to keep track of their barley, and then discovered that writing could do so much more than that, could record myths, could preserve laws, could transmit the words of a woman who lived in the late 3rd millennium BCE to readers 23 centuries later and beyond. They were people who built cities when cities had never been built before, and figured out, imperfectly and through much trial and error, how to organize tens of thousands of human beings into something that functioned. They were people who looked up at the night sky and began to track the movements of the planets and the stars, and who developed mathematics sophisticated enough to predict eclipses, because they wanted to understand the universe they lived in. They were people who wrote a story, 4,000 years ago, about a man who was afraid of death and went on a quest to find immortality and didn't find it, and came home and looked at the walls of his city, and found that this was somehow enough. Or if not enough, if the grief remained, if the fear remained, then at least it was what was real. And the real is what we have to work with. I find that story comforting in the specific way that honest things are comforting. Not the consolation of false promises, but the consolation of company across time. Other people were afraid of death long before us. They built walls anyway. They made things anyway. They told stories about their fear, and the stories are still here, and we are still here. And the stars that the Babylonian astronomers tracked are still moving in the same patterns above us, whether we notice them or not. The rivers are still there too. The Tigris and the Euphrates, risen from the mountains of Turkey, flowing south through Syria and Iraq to the Persian Gulf. They have changed course in places. They are diminished in volume, dammed and diverted for agriculture in a region that still depends on river water. The great cities along their banks are tells now, mounds of accumulated time, still being excavated, still yielding tablets and artifacts and fragments of lives that were lived and ended and buried. Between those rivers, people have been living for 10,000 years, building and losing and building again, worrying and hoping and going on anyway, writing down their accounts, their complaints, their hymns, their stories, feeding their gods, keeping their records, arguing about who owns the irrigation ditch. The world they made is gone, mostly, but not entirely. It is in our base 60 timekeeping. It is in the zodiac. It is in the legal traditions of the ancient world that fed into later traditions that eventually fed into the frameworks we live by now. It is in the very concept of the city, which is a Mesopotamian invention. It is in the idea that stories are worth writing down and preserving, that knowledge is worth transmitting from one generation to the next, that the human record matters. And it is in Gilgamesh, which is still being translated, still being read, still saying something true about the experience of being alive and mortal and loving people who are also alive and mortal. The oldest story is still a story that works. That seems significant if you let yourself think about it. Tonight, in whatever corner of the world you are occupying, in whatever time zone you have drifted through, you are the heir of a very long human project. The Mesopotamians are part of that project. The worried farmer and the temple scribe and the tavern keeper and the astronomical observer and the poet who wrote about a flood that the gods sent because we were too noisy, They are all part of the long, continuous, imperfect, remarkable effort of human beings to make sense of the world and their place in it. They tried. We are still trying. It is late. The lights are low, I hope. The fan is on, or the rain is falling, or the city is quiet in the way cities get quiet after midnight. You have traveled a long way tonight in the most comfortable possible way, horizontally, under blankets, through 4,000 years of human history. The rivers are still flowing between their banks. The stars are still moving in their courses. The walls of ancient cities are underground, waiting. And somewhere in a museum, on a clay tablet, Nani is still composing the most precisely targeted complaint letter in human history. He expected better. He always will. Sleep well.